The island was small enough that you could walk its circumference in 20 minutes on a calm day, though this was not a calm day and you had no intention of walking anywhere except up. The lighthouse rose from the center of the island like a single immense chess piece, whitewashed stone at the base giving way to red-painted iron in the lantern room high above. Its shadow lay long and blue across the scrub grass as you crossed the short stretch of ground between the landing and the tower door, a heavy iron affair set into stone 3 feet thick. You put your shoulder to it and the hinges swung soundlessly, lubricated weakly as part of a routine that never varied, and then you were inside the cool, dim cylinder of the tower, smelling kerosene and salt and the faint metallic tang of old brass. The ground floor was a single round room that served as your kitchen, sitting area and storeroom combined, though each function kept to its own arc of the circle. Against the curved wall to the left stood the small cast-iron stove, cold now but banked with ash from the morning's fire, and beside it a wooden work table scrubbed pale by years of use. Straight ahead the spiral staircase began, a tight helix of cast-iron steps painted grey and worn to a shine in the center of each tread by countless footfalls, not all of them yours. To the right were the storage shelves, and that was where you went first, setting down the canvas mail sack on the table without opening it, because the mail could wait and the weather would not. You climbed the stairs slowly, your boots ringing on the iron treads in a rhythm you knew as well as your own heartbeat. 47 steps to the watchroom, then another 12 to the lantern room itself. The walls were painted a pale cream that looked almost warm when the oil lamps were lit, but in the grey afternoon light seeping through the narrow slit windows, they felt cold and institutional. You counted the steps without meaning to, a habit born of thousands of ascents, and when you reached the watchroom you paused to catch your breath, not because the climb was difficult, but because there was a particular quality to the air here, a stillness that existed nowhere else in the tower. The watchroom was a small circular space walled with windows on all sides, though the glass was streaked with salt and old rain, so that the view outside appeared as a watercolor wash of grey on grey. A desk stood against one segment of wall, upon it the logbook bound in black leather, the inkwell, the pen with its nib already stained dark, the barometer mounted on a brass plate, and a small shelf of reference books with titles like Admiralty List of Lights and Instructions for Light Keepers. You crossed to the desk and stood looking down at the barometer, noting the position of the needle with the same detached attention you might give a clock. It had fallen 0.2 of an inch since the morning reading, and the glass was still dropping with a slow and patient insistence that told you everything you needed to know about the days ahead. You opened the logbook to the current page, a fresh sheet dated in your own hand, and dipped the pen. The nib scratched softly as you wrote the time, the barometric pressure, the wind direction estimated from the set of the waves, the state of the sea, and the visibility, which was closing down by the hour. You did not hurry. Each letter was formed with care, the ink pooling slightly in the downstrokes before you blotted it with the rocking blotter that sat in its own little brass holder. The entry took up 6 lines, no more, and when it was finished you sanded the page lightly and closed the book, leaving the pen across the inkwell in exactly the position you always left it. The clockwork mechanism sat in the center of the watchroom, a tall brass cabinet with glass panels that let you see the gears inside, each one meshed with its neighbor in a descending series of sizes from a large drive wheel at the top to a small escapement at the bottom. The whole assembly was driven by a weight that hung in the center of the stairwell, a cylinder of cast iron that took 4.5 hours to descend the full height of the tower, and you checked the chain now out of habit, noting that it had another hour of travel before you would need to wind it back up. The mechanism made a soft, continuous sound, a ticking that was not a ticking but more of a gentle whir, the sound of interlocking teeth sliding past one another in perfect constant motion. It was the sound of the lighthouse being awake, and you had long since stopped hearing it unless you deliberately listened, the way you might stop hearing your own breathing. You climbed the last 12 steps to the lantern room and opened the trapdoor at the top, emerging into a space that was mostly glass. The lantern room was circular, 10 feet across, with panes of thick glass set into bronze frames that rose from a low iron wall to a domed ceiling painted white. At the center of the room stood the lens itself, a massive construction of curved glass prisms arranged in a pattern that looked like a giant beehive made of crystal, mounted on a bronze pedestal that rotated on a mercury float so smooth you could push it with one finger. The lens was cold now, unlit in the grey day, but it caught what little light existed and sent it scattering in faint rainbows across the walls and ceiling. You stood for a moment just looking at it, the way you always did on first entering the room, because the lens was beautiful in a way that never diminished with familiarity. The lamp sat inside the lens, a brass assembly with multiple concentric wicks and a central oil feed that ran up through the pedestal from the day tank in the room below. You checked the wick even though you had trimmed it that morning, running your thumb along the top edge to make sure it was even, then you checked the oil level in the sight glass, then you checked the flue damper, and then you checked the rotation gear that connected the lens pedestal to the clockwork below. Each check was a small ritual, a touchstone of competence, and you performed them in the same order you always performed them, a sequence that allowed no deviation because deviation was how mistakes were made. By the time you finished with the lamp, the windows had begun to darken, though dusk was still an hour away. The clouds had thickened into a single seamless blanket that pressed down on the sea and the island and the tower with an almost physical weight, and the first drops of rain began to strike the glass with soft percussive taps, each one a tiny sound that seemed to come from very far away. You descended to the watchroom and lit the small oil lamp on the desk, turning up the wick until a steady yellow glow pushed the shadows back into the corners, and then you sat in the wooden chair and listened to the rain grow heavier. There was time before the evening lighting, a block of 40 minutes that you might once have filled with reading or mending or simply sitting still. On this particular evening you chose to make a full inventory of the oil stores, not because you expected to find anything amiss, but because the routine was soothing in the way that all routines were soothing when the barometer was falling and the sea was beginning to make sounds you recognized. You went back down the 47 steps, your hand trailing along the iron railing, and entered the ground floor room where the heaviest supplies were kept. The oil was stored in the small room behind the stove, a space barely large enough for one man to turn around in, lined with wooden racks that held the tins in neat rows. Each tin was a rectangular can of thick tin plate, painted dark green with a capacity of 1 imperial gallon. You counted them from left to right and top to bottom, touching each one with your fingertip as you went, murmuring the numbers under your breath. 16 full tins, plus the one already open beside the filling station, plus the oil already in the day tank, plus the oil already in the lamp reservoir. That was sufficient for 12 days of continuous burning at the standard wick setting, and you would be burning at a higher setting if the visibility dropped further, so perhaps 9 days. The storm was forecast to last 3, and you always kept a margin of twice the expected duration, which meant your margin was exactly right. You noted this in a small pocket notebook with a stub of pencil, a secondary record that you would transfer to the main log later. The wicks were stored in a tin box lined with waxed paper, flat cotton ribbons of varying widths cut to precise lengths for the different lamp components. You counted those too, 24 of the wide wicks for the main flame and 36 of the narrow ones for the pilot, enough for months of continuous service. Next to the wick box stood the cleaning supplies, the chamois cloths for the lens, the soft brushes for the prisms, the jar of rouge powder for polishing the brass, the tin of fine oil for the clockwork pivots. Each item occupied its designated space, and you verified each one, not because you doubted their presence, but because the act of verification itself was a form of meditation, a way of placing yourself firmly within the walls of the tower and the boundaries of your duty. The food stores you checked last, though they had been replenished that very morning by the supply boat, and you already knew their contents. The burlap sack of flour sat heavily on the bottom shelf, its top rolled down in a neat cuff, and beside it a small crock of salted butter, a wheel of hard cheese wrapped in muslin, a smoked ham hanging from a hook, a tin of tea, a tin of sugar, a sack of potatoes, a string of onions, and 3 loaves of bread baked the previous day at the mainland bakery and still faintly fragrant when you bent close. The water tank in the floor held 60 gallons of fresh rainwater filtered through the tower's own cistern, and the gauge showed it was full, a fact you had already checked that morning, but checked again now because the storm might damage the catchment system, and it was better to know the starting level with certainty. You ate your evening meal standing at the work table, a simple affair of bread and cheese and a mug of tea brewed strong and dark, and you ate it without hurry, chewing each mouthful until the bread turned sweet on your tongue. The wind had risen while you were checking the stores, and now it made a low humming sound in the iron chimney of the stove, a note that vibrated in your chest when you stood too close. You finished the meal, washed the single plate and the single mug in the small basin, set them in the rack to dry, and wiped the table clean with a cloth that you then folded precisely into quarters and laid over the edge of the basin. Then it was time to light the lamp. You climbed the stairs for the third time that day, the 47 steps and the 12 steps, and by the time you reached the watchroom, the wind was loud enough that you could hear it even through the thick walls, a constant pressure of sound like a distant waterfall. You took the box of lucifer matches from its shelf beside the clockwork mechanism and went up into the lantern room, where dusk had turned the glass panes into dark mirrors that reflected your own face back at you from a dozen angles. Lighting the lamp was a sequence of precise actions that you had performed so many times your hands moved through them without conscious thought. First you turned the small wheel that raised the pilot wick, just a quarter turn, exposing a tiny lip of woven cotton. Then you struck the lucifer match, a single sharp scratch against the iron striker plate, and held the small flame to the wick until it caught with a blue-yellow flicker. The pilot flame established itself immediately, a steady teardrop of light that you adjusted with the wheel until it burned clean and smokeless. You waited 30 seconds, counting them silently, to let the pilot chamber warm, and then you turned the main valve that admitted oil to the primary wicks. The flame grew from a glow to a blaze, filling the interior of the lens with a light that was almost too bright to look at directly, and you adjusted the wick height with the main wheel until the flame burned a pure white with just the faintest hint of yellow at the tips, the color that gave the greatest light output for the least oil consumption. The lens caught the light and transformed it. What had been a simple lamp flame was now a patterned beam that reached out through the glass in a great horizontal fan, rotating slowly as the clockwork turned the entire lens assembly on its mercury bearing. You stepped to the window and watched the beam sweep out across the sea, illuminating the rain in a moving wedge of white. And you knew that somewhere out there, if there was any ship at all within the 20-mile reach of the light, someone was seeing that beam and feeling a small measure of relief. You would not know if that was true, and you would likely never meet anyone who had seen your light, but the possibility was enough. The rain was falling in earnest now, driven nearly horizontal by the wind that had continued to build while you worked. It struck the glass in sheets rather than individual drops, and the sound of it was a continuous hiss that overlaid the deeper hum of the wind in the ironwork. You closed the trapdoor to the watchroom below, sealing the lantern room from the rest of the tower, and the space became a small warm bubble of light and glass suspended over the dark sea. The lens rotated with a soft, regular sound, a slight whisper of glass moving on mercury, and the beam swept out again and again and again, a rhythm that would continue without interruption until you chose to stop it. You went back down to the watchroom and settled into the chair beside the desk. The logbook was open where you had left it, and you added a new entry noting the time of lighting, the wick setting, the rotation speed, and the visibility, which you estimated at 1/2 mile and falling. The ink dried quickly in the warm air, and you blotted it anyway, then sanded it, then closed the book and placed the pen in its holder. The clock on the wall showed 7 in the evening, though without the clock you would not have known if it was 7 or midnight or noon, because the world outside the windows was a uniform darkness without any feature that might distinguish one hour from another. You sat and listened to the storm. The wind found a steady note in the iron stays that braced the lantern room, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and the sea made a heavier sound below, a series of impacts followed by long withdrawing rushes as the waves struck the rocks and retreated. The two sounds together formed a kind of music, monotonous and vast, and you let it wash over you without resistance, knowing that this was the sound of the next 3 days, a sound you would come to know as intimately as the ticking of the clockwork or the soft scratch of your own pen on the logbook page. The evening passed in the slow sequence of small tasks that filled the hours between lighting and the midnight check. You wound the clockwork weight back to the top of its travel, turning the crank with a steady, even pressure, counting the revolutions under your breath until you felt the resistance that told you the weight was fully raised. The mechanism gave a small settling sound, the gears finding their new equilibrium, and then resumed its quiet whir without any change in rhythm. You wiped the brass casing of the mechanism with a soft cloth, removing the faint film of oil vapor that had settled on the metal since morning, and then you wiped the barometer too, and the lamp chimney, and the handle of the logbook pen, until every surface within reach had been attended to. When there was nothing left to wipe or adjust or check, you sat in the chair and looked out the windows at the nothing that was there. The rain ran down the glass in rivulets that caught the light from the desk lamp and threw small moving shadows on the wall behind you. The beam from the lighthouse swept by every 8 seconds, a bright bar of light that crossed your field of vision and then was gone, replaced by the deeper darkness that followed each rotation, a cycle that had been repeating since before you arrived at this station and would continue repeating long after you left. You were merely the person currently attending to it, a temporary custodian of a permanent light, and that thought brought a quiet satisfaction that was not pride but something closer to contentment. At midnight you made your scheduled check, climbing the 12 steps to the lantern room with a small hand lamp swinging from your fingers. The main flame was burning perfectly, its white heart steady and silent inside the turning lens, and the oil level in the sight glass had dropped by precisely the amount you expected. You turned the wick adjustment by the smallest fraction, compensating for the slight carbon buildup that always accumulated in the first few hours of burning, and then you stood at the window for a full minute, watching the beam sweep out into the rain. There was nothing to see except the rain itself, illuminated in a moving curtain that stretched a few 100 feet before the darkness swallowed it entirely, and that was exactly what you expected to see. You noted the check in the logbook, a single line with the time and the wick adjustment, and then you went down the 47 steps to your bed in the small sleeping alcove off the ground floor room, where you undressed in the dark and lay down under the wool blankets and listened to the storm continue its long, slow work around you. The sound already so familiar, the transition to carried into rest by the steady drumming of rain on stone and glass and iron. You woke not to a sound, but to a change in sound, a subtle shift in the note the wind made as it moved through the tower's iron fittings. The deep hum that had been a constant through the early hours of the night had risen half a tone, settling into a steadier pitch that seemed to vibrate directly through the stone floor and into the iron bed frame. You lay still for a moment with your eyes open to the darkness, letting your senses orient themselves. The storm had found its rhythm, moving from the gusty unevenness of a fresh blow into the sustained pressure of a mature gale, and everything about the tower responded to this change as a single tuned instrument. Even the wool blanket over your chest seemed to hum faintly in sympathy, a sensation more felt than heard. You pushed the blanket aside and sat up on the edge of the bed, your bare feet finding the cold floorboards with the familiarity of long habit. The sleeping alcove was a narrow space carved from the thick wall of the tower's ground floor, just large enough for the iron bedstead and a small wooden chest that held your spare clothing. There was no window, but the quality of the darkness was absolute in a way that told you the moon and stars were far above the cloud layer and would remain there for some time. You dressed in the dark, pulling on your wool trousers and the heavy knitted jumper that hung from a peg by the door, and then you lit the small hand lamp that waited on the chest, adjusting its wick to a low, steady flame that threw soft shadows across the curved stone walls. The clock in the watchroom had not yet struck the hour, so you stood for a moment in the ground floor room and listened to the tower. The stove had long since gone cold, the firebox full of grey ash that shifted slightly with the vibration in the floor, a faint rustling that blended with the deeper sounds of the storm. The oil tins in the storeroom gave off a low metallic ring every time a stronger gust pressed against the tower's seaward wall, a sound you had heard in many storms and had come to associate with a particular wind speed that was now blowing. All of these sounds together formed a signature that told you the weather was doing exactly what you expected it to do, and that your presence was required in the lantern room for the scheduled check. You climbed the spiral stairs with the hand lamp held before you, its small circle of light moving across the cream-painted walls and the iron treads in a steady bobbing pattern. The 47 steps to the watchroom seemed longer at night, though they were exactly the same length as during the day, and the climb gave you time to wake fully, the slight exertion warming your muscles and sharpening your attention. The sound of the wind grew louder as you ascended, finding new resonances in the upper reaches of the tower, and by the time you reached the watchroom, it was a steady pressure against the windows, a deep organ note that underlay everything else. The watchroom was as you had left it, the desk lamp turned low but still burning, the logbook open, the barometer on its brass plate. You checked the barometer first, tilting your head to read the needle in the dim light. It had fallen another 1/10 of an inch since midnight, a slow decline that matched the steady increase in the wind's force. You noted this in the logbook with the same careful script you always used, adding the time and a brief observation of the wind direction, which had backed slightly to the north. Then you hung the hand lamp on its hook and climbed the 12 steps to the lantern room, pushing open the trapdoor and rising into the circle of light that was the lighthouse's true purpose. The lens was still turning, the beam sweeping out into the night with the same 8-second rhythm you had set at dusk, and the main flame burned as steady as a star inside its crystal heart. You approached the lamp and stood within the rotating assembly, the great glass prisms moving past your shoulders with a whisper of mercury and polished brass, and you inspected the flame with the close attention that the midnight check demanded. The wick was burning with a small amount of carbon buildup at the tip, a dark crust that reduced the light output by a fraction you could see, but most people would not notice, and you reached for the trimming tools that hung on a hook beside the lamp pedestal. Trimming the wick was a procedure that required a steady hand and a complete absence of haste. You lifted the glass chimney carefully, setting it aside on its felt pad, and then you took the small brass scissors designed specifically for this purpose, their blades curved to match the arc of the circular wick. The flame flickered once in the draft but held steady, and you snicked away the carbonized tip with a single smooth motion, catching the dark fragment in the small tin cup you held beneath the scissors. The trimmed wick immediately burned cleaner and brighter, the flame rising a 1/4 inch and settling into a pure white cone, and you replaced the chimney and watched for a full minute to be certain the burn was stable. Satisfied, you returned the trimming tools to their hook, emptied the carbon fragments into the waste tin, and made a small adjustment to the oil valve to compensate for the cleaner burn rate. You did a slow circuit of the lantern room, walking along the circular gallery with your hand trailing along the brass railing, feeling the cold metal under your palm. The rain was still falling heavily, striking the glass in sheets that blurred the beam's outward passage, but between sheets you could see the sea heaving in great dark swells that caught the light for a moment and then vanished. The beam cut through the rain like a solid thing, a wedge of white that illuminated the falling drops for 100 feet in every direction, and watching it gave you a sense of the storm's scale that the sounds alone could not convey. The waves were high but not yet dangerous, 6 feet perhaps, 8 on the larger sets, and the rhythm was regular, a slow breathing of the ocean that matched the pulse of the rotating lens. You completed the circuit, checked the oil level in the sight glass one final time, and then descended to the watchroom, closing the trapdoor behind you to keep the warmth in the lantern room. The watchroom felt quiet after the brightness above, its single oil lamp throwing a smaller, yellower light that pooled on the desk and left the edges of the room in shadow. You stood for a moment considering your next action, and the answer came to you with the clarity of routine: a cup of tea. The kettle waited on a small spirit stove in the corner, a brass contraption with a wick of its own and a reservoir of methylated spirits that you filled once a week. You lit the spirit stove with a lucifer from the box on the desk, adjusted the flame to a low blue flicker, and set the kettle on its trivet to heat. While the water warmed, you sat at the desk and opened the logbook to a fresh page. The previous entries filled the page with neat rows of times and pressures and wind speeds, a record of steady decline that you had been maintaining since the supply boat left. Now you added to it, writing the current time, the barometer reading, the state of the wick after trimming, and the visibility, which you estimated at less than half a mile. Then, because the storm had settled into its rhythm and there was nothing else that required your immediate attention, you began to write a longer observation. The kind of descriptive entry that the logbook's margins allowed for and that you sometimes filled when the hours stretched long and uneventful. You described the sea state in careful detail, the words forming under your pen with the same methodical precision you applied to all your duties. The waves were coming from the north-northwest, driven by a wind that you estimated at force 7 on the Beaufort scale, a near gale that produced white foam crests on every wave and sent spray flying from the tops in long white streamers. The interval between waves was roughly 6 seconds, a short, steep chop rather than the long, rolling swell of deep ocean, which told you the wind had been blowing over a relatively short fetch and was still building the sea rather than sustaining a fully developed wave field. You noted the color of the water, a dark gunmetal gray that looked almost black where the light did not strike it, and you noted the way the white foam glowed briefly in the beam's passing, a phosphorescence of reflected light rather than true bioluminescence. The kettle began to simmer, a soft hiss that joined the other sounds of the watchroom. You rose and prepared the tea with the same methodical attention you gave to everything else. The brown earthenware teapot warmed with a splash of hot water, the tea leaves measured by eye from the tin, the boiling water poured in a steady stream, the lid replaced, the pot left to steep on its trivet beside the stove. You returned to the desk while the tea brewed, picking up the pen again and adding a note about the wind's sound in the ironwork, how it had found a steady note that you could feel as much as hear, a vibration that seemed to live in the stone itself. You wrote that the foghorn had not yet been required because the visibility, though poor, was still sufficient for the light to be seen at the necessary range, and you wrote that you would continue to monitor this and activate the horn if the rain thickened to true fog. The tea was ready after 4 minutes of steeping, the exact time you always allowed. You poured a mugful through the small strainer, watching the dark liquid fill the white porcelain with a color that was almost black in the dim lamplight, and you added a splash of milk from the small jug that sat on the windowsill, where the cold kept it fresh. The first sip was hot enough to scald, but you took it carefully, blowing across the surface until the steam thinned. And then you drank with the mug cradled in both hands, feeling the warmth spread through your palms and down into your fingers. There was a particular comfort in hot tea during a night watch, a simple animal satisfaction that made the storm outside seem less immediate, less personal, as if the circle of lamplight and the warmth of the mug created a small separate world that the weather could not enter. You sat with the tea in the logbook and let your thoughts drift without direction. The clock in the watchroom ticked its steady mechanical tick. The lens turned above your head with its soft whisper. The wind hummed in the iron stays, and the rain washed across the windows in long, sweeping gusts that ebbed and flowed like breathing. You wrote a few more lines in the logbook, recording the time of your tea and a small adjustment you had made to the wick, and then you closed the book and simply sat, allowing yourself to be still. The hours of a night watch passed differently from the hours of the day. During the day, there were always tasks to fill the time, cleaning and polishing and checking and maintaining, a long list of small duties that kept your hands busy and your attention engaged. At night the duties were fewer and farther apart, and the spaces between them stretched out into long quiet intervals that required a different kind of attention, a patient watchfulness that was less about doing and more about being. You had learned this skill gradually over your years of service, the ability to sit still and alert without restlessness, to let the time flow past you without trying to hold it or hurry it. It was a skill that many new keepers struggled with, accustomed as they were to constant activity, but you had come to value these quiet hours as a kind of meditation, a time when the tower and the storm and the light all existed in a harmonious balance that required nothing from you except your presence. The wind shifted slightly, backing another few degrees to the north, and you noted the change in the logbook without needing to consult the weather vane above the lantern room, reading it instead in the way the rain struck the window glass and the subtle alteration in the tower's vibration. The new angle brought a different set of gusts, ones that wrapped around the tower's curve and created small eddies that rattled the loose pane in the northwest window, a sound you had been meaning to fix for weeks but had never quite gotten around to. The pane was secure enough, its putty old but still holding, and the rattle was more an annoyance than a danger. A small percussive addition to the night's symphony that you accepted as part of the tower's character. You finished your tea and rinsed the mug in the small basin, setting it upside down on the wooden drying rack. The spirit stove had burned itself out, the blue flame guttering and dying when the methylated spirits were exhausted, and you made a mental note to refill the reservoir in the morning. Then you performed a final check of the clockwork mechanism, laying your palm flat against the brass casing to feel the steady vibration of the gears inside, a sensation that reassured you in the same way a heartbeat might reassure a doctor. The weight was still descending smoothly, the chain feeding through the drive wheel without any skipping or catching, and the rotation speed was exactly 8 seconds per full revolution, a rate you verified by counting silently with your eyes on the second hand of the wall clock. Satisfied that everything was as it should be, you picked up the hand lamp and began the descent to the ground floor, the 47 steps ringing softly under your boots. The sound of the storm faded slightly as you went down, the stone walls absorbing the higher frequencies and leaving only the deep bass hum that had become so familiar you barely noticed it anymore. The ground floor room was cold after the warmth of the watchroom, and you added a few pieces of driftwood to the stove from the basket beside it, arranging them in a careful stack with kindling beneath. You did not light the fire, not yet, because you would be returning to bed shortly and the stove could wait until morning, but the preparation was another small ritual, a promise to your future self that warmth would be waiting when you rose. You went to the sleeping alcove and undressed again, hanging your trousers and jumper on the pegs, and you lay down under the blanket with the hand lamp still burning on the chest, its flame turned low. The bed was cold, but your body heat would warm it soon enough, and you lay on your back with your eyes open, listening to the storm continue its long work around you. The wind had found its rhythm and would hold it for hours yet, a deep steady note that seemed to be the fundamental tone of the whole night. And under it the rain fell in its own complex pattern, 1,000 small impacts that merged into a continuous wash of sound. You let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of the lens above, the 8-second cycle of light and dark that you could not see from your alcove but could feel as a faint pulse in the fabric of the tower, a heartbeat that had been beating since the first lighthouse was built on the first rock and would beat long after you were gone. You closed your eyes and let the sound carry you back towards sleep, the storm no longer a threat or an event, but simply the weather, the background condition of your small world, as steady and reliable as the clockwork and the flame. Dawn came without a sunrise. The black of the night sky softened by imperceptible degrees into a deep charcoal, then a lighter grey, and finally into the flat pewter tone that would serve as daylight for the remainder of the storm's duration. You were already awake when this slow brightening began, standing in the watch-room with a fresh mug of tea steaming in your hand, having risen an hour earlier to perform the pre-dawn lamp check. The beam still swept out across the sea with its 8-second rhythm, but now the darkness it cut through was marginally less complete, and you could just make out the shape of the nearest rocks at the base of the tower, black teeth against the grey foam. You had lit the stove an hour ago, the driftwood catching quickly under the match flame and building into a cheerful crackle that had driven the night's chill from the ground floor room. The kettle had boiled while you tended the fire, and now the tea was a warm, solid weight in your hands as you stood watching the slow birth of a day that would be, in every meaningful sense, identical to the night that preceded it. This was not a complaint or even an observation of hardship, merely a fact of life during a long storm, and you accepted it with the same quiet equanimity that you accepted the barometer's steady fall and the wind's steady rise. The morning duties were a longer list than the night checks, a sequence of tasks that you performed in the same order each day regardless of weather. The first of these was winding the clockwork mechanism fully, a task that required you to descend to the ground floor and the weight shaft that ran through the center of the spiral stair. The weight was a cylinder of cast iron nearly 3 feet long and 8 inches in diameter, suspended on a heavy chain that ran up through a series of pulleys to the drive wheel in the watchroom above. Winding it was a matter of turning the large crank handle that projected from the wall beside the stove, a solid iron bar with a wooden grip, worn smooth by generations of hands. You took the handle in both hands and began to turn, slowly at first to feel the resistance, then with a steady rhythm that made the chain clink softly through its guides. Each full revolution of the crank raised the weight by perhaps 2 inches, and you counted the turns in your head, a number you had memorized long ago. 47 turns to raise the weight from the bottom of its travel to the top, each turn requiring the same steady pressure, the same circular motion of your shoulders and arms. The work was not hard, but it was continuous, and by the 30th turn you could feel a warmth spreading through your back and chest, a pleasant physical sensation that reminded you of the strength in your own body. The gears above responded to the winding with small settling sounds, metallic clicks and hums that told you the mechanism was accepting the new tension, and when you reached the 47th turn the resistance increased sharply, signaling that the weight was fully raised and the clockwork had a full cycle of stored energy to draw upon. You released the crank, and it stayed in position, held by a ratchet that prevented the weight from descending while the handle was at rest. The mechanism continued its quiet whir, the sound unchanged by the fresh winding, except perhaps a fraction louder, a slightly more confident note in the mesh of the gears. You wiped your hands on the cloth that hung from a hook beside the crank and made a note in the pocket notebook, a small penciled mark that would be transferred to the main log later, weight wound, time recorded, mechanism functioning normally. The oil for the lamp was your next concern. The day tank in the watchroom held enough oil for roughly 12 hours of burning at the standard rate, and you had been burning at a slightly higher rate through the night to compensate for the reduced visibility. A check of the sight glass confirmed that the tank was a little more than half full, which meant you would need to refill it before the day was out, and it was better to do it now while the morning was young and the list of tasks was still manageable. You went down to the storeroom behind the stove and retrieved one of the green tinplate cans from its rack, hefting it with both hands and carrying it carefully up the spiral stairs. The climb with the oil can was slower than usual, each step taken with deliberation to avoid sloshing the contents or catching the can's rim on the narrow walls. The oil was heavy, a thick mineral liquid with a distinctive smell that you had long ago stopped noticing except when handling it directly, a sharp, clean scent like paraffin mixed with something earthier. When you reached the watchroom, you set the can on the floor beside the day tank and unscrewed the filler cap, a brass fitting with a fine thread that required 4.5 turns to remove. You then lifted the oil can with both hands and tipped it carefully, pouring the oil into the tank in a smooth amber stream that gurgled softly as the air displaced from the tank bubbled up through it. The tank filled to the brim, and you stopped pouring with a slight tilt back of the can, catching the last drip on the rim. The filler cap went back on with its 4.5 turns, tightened just enough to seal but not so tight that it would bind. And the oil can went back down to its place in the storeroom, still a quarter full, enough for topping up later if needed, but not so much that it would be unwieldy to carry. The whole procedure had taken perhaps 10 minutes, and you recorded it in the logbook, with the same careful hand, adding the amount of oil used and the estimated burn rate for the night so far. The lens required its own form of attention each morning, a cleaning ritual that you performed with the chamois cloth and the soft brushes. You climbed the 12 steps to the lantern room while the daylight continued its slow brightening outside, the grey light now strong enough that you could see the rain streaking the glass in continuous rivulets. The lens was still turning, the beam still sweeping, but the lamp flame looked smaller and paler in the growing daylight, and soon it would be time to extinguish it entirely. Before that, though, you would clean the glass prisms that surrounded the lamp, removing the thin film of oil vapor and salt that accumulated on their surfaces during the night's burning. You took the chamois cloth from its hook and began at the top of the lens assembly, working your way around the great glass prisms in slow circles. The cloth was soft and slightly oily, impregnated with the residue of countless previous cleanings, and it slid over the curved glass surfaces with a faint squeaking sound that was the only indication of friction. Each prism was a complex shape, curved on its outer face and faceted on its inner, designed to catch the lamp's light and bend it into the precise horizontal fan that gave the lighthouse its characteristic beam pattern. You cleaned each face with the same number of passes, 3 for the outer curves and 2 for the inner facets, and then you moved on to the next prism in the ring. The work was repetitive in a way that you found deeply calming, a task that occupied your hands while leaving your mind free to drift. You thought about the design of a lens as you cleaned it, the way a French physicist named Fresnel had calculated the exact curves needed to capture every ray of light from a single central flame and direct it outward in a flat beam. Before Fresnel lenses, lighthouses had used simple mirrors, which scattered more light than they directed, and the keepers had burned enormous fires of coal or wood that consumed fuel at a prodigious rate while producing relatively little useful illumination. The lens you were now cleaning, with its rings of precisely ground glass, could take a flame no larger than your fist and throw its light 20 miles across open water, a miracle of 19th century engineering that you had the privilege of maintaining. You finished the prisms and moved on to the central bullseye lens, the largest single piece of glass in the assembly, a thick curved disc that sat directly in front of the lamp and concentrated the light into the brightest part of the beam. This lens required extra care because any scratch or clouding would reduce the light's range, and you polished it with slow, deliberate strokes, checking your work by looking through the glass at an angle to catch any remaining smears. The glass was flawless, as it always was, and when you were satisfied you folded the chamois cloth and returned it to its hook. The windows came next, though you could only clean the inside surfaces while the storm raged. The outside would have to wait until the weather cleared, and the salt crust that was already building up on the outer glass would remain there, a rough white film that diffracted the light slightly and reduced the beam's sharpness by a small but measurable degree. You wet a clean cloth with fresh water from the small basin and wiped each window pane from top to bottom, working in long straight strokes that left the glass momentarily clear before the rain outside beat it up again. The view through the clean windows was the same grey sea and grey sky you had been watching for the past day, the waves marching in from the north-northwest with their white caps and their long foam trails. With the lens clean and the windows as clean as they could be, you returned to the watchroom and prepared to extinguish the lamp. This was another precise procedure, the reverse of the lighting ritual, and you performed it with the same methodical care. You closed the main oil valve first, cutting off the fuel supply to the primary wicks, and the flame shrank immediately from a bright white cone to a small blue flicker. You let it burn for a full minute to consume the remaining oil in the wick chamber, preventing drips and carbon buildup, and then you turned the wheel that lowered the wick into its housing. The flame guttered once and went out, leaving a thin trail of smoke that rose straight up and dissipated against the ceiling. The pilot flame you left burning, because relighting it was more trouble than maintaining it, and its tiny teardrop of light used almost no oil and produced almost no heat. The lens continued to turn even without the lamp lit, the clockwork indifferent to the presence or absence of light. You stopped it with a small lever that engaged a brake on the drive gear, and the whisper of the mercury float ceased, leaving the lens still and silent in the grey morning. The lantern room suddenly felt larger and emptier without the turning light, a glass-walled space suspended over the sea rather than the heart of a living beacon. You stood for a moment with your hand on the brake lever, feeling the faint vibration of the clockwork transmitted through the metal, and then you descended to the watchroom and recorded the extinguishing time in the logbook. Morning duties complete, you allowed yourself a brief rest. The chair beside the desk had become molded to your shape over the months of your posting, its wooden seat slightly hollowed and its back angled just so, and you settled into it with the ease of long familiarity. The tea in your mug had gone cold, but you drank it anyway, the bitter, lukewarm liquid, a small reminder that the day's routines had been observed and the light was safe for another morning. Through the windows the grey day continued its slow unfolding, the rain falling steadily, the wind humming its deep note in the ironwork, the sea marching toward the rocks in rows of white-capped waves that looked from this height like the furrows of a grey field being endlessly ploughed. You felt about the foundation stones, the ones at the very base of the tower where it met the island's rock. During every storm you made a point of checking them at least once, descending the narrow ladder that led from the ground floor to the small cellar-like space where the tower's footings were exposed. The sea could seep through tiny cracks in the mortar, and though the tower had stood for 60 years and would stand for 60 more, the inspection was part of the routine, and you had no reason to skip it. You rose from the chair, stretched your arms once, and began the descent to the ground floor, your boots ringing on the iron steps with the same steady rhythm they had kept for 2 days now. The cellar was a low space with a packed earth floor and stone walls that glistened faintly in the light of your hand lamp. The foundation stones were enormous blocks of granite, each one the size of a small table, fitted together with mortar that had turned grey and crumbly with age, but still held firm. You walked the perimeter slowly, holding the lamp close to the wall, checking the joints for any sign of water seepage or fresh cracks. The mortar was damp in places, which was normal during a storm, but there was no running water and no new fractures, only the same old hairline cracks that had been there since your first inspection and would be there for your last. You pressed your palm against the stone in several places, feeling for vibration or movement, and found only the solid, immovable weight of granite anchored to granite. The inspection took 15 minutes and yielded nothing of concern. You climbed back up to the ground floor, brushed the dirt from your knees, and washed your hands in the small basin. The stove had burned down to a bed of hot coals, and you added another piece of driftwood, pushing it into the embers with the iron poker until it caught and flared up, the flames throwing dancing shadows on the curved walls. The warmth from the stove was the heart of the living quarters, and you stood beside it for a moment, holding your hands out to the heat and feeling the stiffness leave your knuckles. Hunger made itself known with a small hollow sensation in your stomach, and you turned your attention to the preparation of breakfast. The bread was still fresh, only a day old, and you cut 2 thick slices with the bread knife, a long serrated blade that had been sharpened so many times the steel was visibly thinner at the center. You spread butter on each slice, the butter cold and hard from its crock, and then you cut several thin slices of the hard cheese and laid them carefully on the bread. The ham you left for later, a treat for the evening meal, but you did fry a single egg in the small iron skillet, the white spreading and sizzling in the butter until the edges turned crisp and brown. The yolk you left runny, the way you preferred it, and you ate the egg directly from the skillet with the bread and cheese, standing at the work table while the storm continued its steady percussion against the tower walls. Eating alone was so habitual that you no longer noticed the silence at meals. There was no conversation to fill, no companion to consider, only the simple act of chewing and swallowing, and the occasional sound of the skillet shifting on the stove grate, or the wind changing its note in the chimney. You finished the meal, washed the skillets and the plate and the fork, and set them in the drying rack. The routine of cooking and cleaning after yourself was as ingrained as the routine of the light, a series of small actions that filled the time and kept the living space orderly and pleasant. After breakfast, you returned to the watchroom and sat again at the desk, opening the logbook to record the morning's work. The page was filling up with your neat rows of times and observations, a document that would eventually be reviewed by the lighthouse inspector on his quarterly visit, and filed away in some office on the mainland, read perhaps once and then archived for decades. You did not write for the inspector, though. You wrote for yourself, for the satisfaction of seeing the hours accounted for and the duties discharged. The pen moved across the page in its familiar rhythm, and when you finished the entry you blotted it and sanded it and closed the book with the same care you gave everything else. The day stretched ahead of you, a long grey expanse of hours that would need to be filled with small tasks and patient waiting. The storm would continue, the wind would blow, the rain would fall, and you would remain at your post, attending to the light and the tower and the 1,000 small details that kept them both functioning. This was the life you had chosen, or that had chosen you, and as you sat in the quiet watchroom with the barometer falling and the sea heaving and the clockwork ticking its steady measure, you could not imagine wanting anything different. Midday arrived without ceremony, marked only by the soft chime of the clock in the watchroom and the corresponding shift in the quality of the grey light that pressed against the tower windows. You were sitting at the desk, the logbook open before you, the pen idle in your hand, while you listened to the storm continue its steady work. The wind had held its note for hours now, a deep baritone hum that resonated in the iron stays, and the rain fell in undulating curtains that wrapped the tower in a continuous shimmer of water. The clock chimed 12 times, each strike a clean brass note that cut through the background drone and then faded, leaving the storm to reclaim the silence. You had noticed the loose ventilator cowl 2 days earlier, a small rattling sound that came from the roof of the lantern room whenever the wind backed to a particular quarter. The cowl was a conical iron cap that sat atop the ventilation pipe, designed to spin with the wind and draw fresh air through the tower, while preventing rain from entering. One of the 3 bolts that held its base plate to the roof flange had worked slightly loose, the nut backing off by perhaps 2 full turns, and the resulting vibration produced a metallic chatter that you could hear from the watchroom when the gusts were strong enough. It was not a danger, not yet, but it was the sort of small imperfection that you preferred to address before it became a larger problem, and the storm would not be ending for at least another day, so you decided that the middle of the day was as good a time as any for small repairs. You closed the logbook and rose from the chair, pausing to stretch your arms above your head and feel the pleasant pull of muscle across your shoulders. The tower's interior was warm from the stove below, the heat rising through the central stairwell and collecting in the upper rooms, and you were comfortable in your wool jumper with the sleeves pushed back to your elbows. You went down the 47 steps to the ground floor, not hurrying, each footfall placed deliberately on the worn iron treads, and you retrieved the wooden toolbox from its shelf in the storeroom. The toolbox was a solid pine chest with dovetailed corners and a rope handle, built by a previous keeper whose initials were carved into the lid in small, neat letters. You set it on the work table and opened the brass catches, lifting the lid to reveal the tools arranged in their fitted compartments. The interior smelled of machine oil and old wood, a scent that you associated with competence and preparation. Each tool had its place, the monkey wrench in the long slot at the back, the screwdrivers in their graduated row, the ball-peen hammer, the cold chisel, the hand drill with its set of bits, the tin of assorted screws and bolts, the small pot of axle grease, and the folded sheets of emery cloth. You selected the monkey wrench first, lifting it from its slot and feeling the weight settle into your palm. The wrench was a heavy tool, cast from a single piece of forged steel, with a fixed upper jaw and a lower jaw that adjusted by turning a knurled thumb wheel set into the handle. The thumb wheel moved smoothly when you tested it, the threads well lubricated and free of rust, and the jaws opened and closed with a solid, mechanical precision that spoke of good manufacture. You set the wrench on the table and then selected a medium flathead screwdriver, its tip slightly rounded from use but still square enough to seat firmly in a screw slot, the wooden handle worn dark and smooth by the grip of many hands over many years. The monkey wrench and the screwdriver went into the pocket of your canvas apron, which hung from a hook beside the stove and which you tied around your waist with a double knot. You added a small tin of penetrating oil to the pocket, along with a clean rag, and then you closed the toolbox and returned it to its shelf. The climb back up the spiral stairs was slower this time, the tools bumping gently against your thigh with each step, and you found yourself thinking about the nature of small repairs, the way that attending to minor problems was a form of preventive care that kept larger problems from ever arising. The ventilator cowl was a minor problem, a loose bolt that could be tightened in 5 minutes, but if left unattended the vibration could crack the base plate or enlarge the bolt hole or eventually allow water to seep into the lantern room ceiling, and then a 5-minute job would become a 5-hour job, requiring parts and skills you did not possess. So you tighten the bolts now, during the quiet midday hours, and by doing so you maintain the integrity of the whole system. The lantern room was cold after the watchroom, the wind drawing heat away through the glass panels despite their thickness, and you buttoned the top of your jumper before opening the trapdoor that led to the roof. The trapdoor was a small square hatch set into the domed ceiling, accessed by a short iron ladder bolted to the wall, and you climbed it carefully, pushing the hatch open against the wind's resistance and emerging onto the narrow circular walkway that surrounded the lantern roof. The wind at this height was a physical presence that pushed against your chest with a steady, insistent pressure, and the rain, which had seemed heavy from inside, was a stinging, horizontal spray that immediately beaded on your face and hands. You crouched low, one hand on the iron railing, and made your way around the curved walkway to where the ventilation pipe projected from the roof. A stout iron tube about 8 inches in diameter, capped by the conical cowl. The cowl was spinning slowly, its vanes catching the wind and turning the whole assembly with a soft creak, and you could see the base plate, where the 3 bolts passed through oval slots into the roof flange. 2 of the bolts were tight, their nuts flush against the plate and showing no sign of movement. The 3rd bolt, the one nearest the seaward side, had indeed loosened. Its nut backed off until a gap of perhaps a 1/4 inch showed between the nut and the plate, and the bolt itself was vibrating visibly, a rapid shimmer that produced the chattering sound you had been hearing. You knelt on the wet iron walkway, the knees of your trousers immediately soaking through, and you took the monkey wrench from your apron pocket. The thumb wheel needed a 1/4 turn to snug the jaws around the nut, and then you applied pressure to the handle, turning the nut clockwise in small increments. The threads were dry and slightly stiff, the penetrating oil from your last maintenance having washed away in the rain, so you stopped after the first few turns and retrieved the small oil tin from your pocket. The oil was thick and amber, and you applied a single drop to the exposed threads above the nut, watching it wick into the narrow gap between bolt and nut. You waited 30 seconds for the oil to penetrate, the wind pushing at your back and the rain running down your collar, and then you resumed tightening with the wrench. The nut turned more easily now, the oil having done its work, and you tightened it until it seated firmly against the base plate. You did not over-tighten because over-tightening could strip the threads or deform the soft iron of the plate, but you applied enough pressure that the nut would not back off again under vibration. The bolt stopped vibrating immediately, its shimmer replaced by the same solid stillness as its neighbors, and the chattering sound ceased, leaving only the deeper hum of the wind in the stays and the rush of the rain against the roof. You checked the other 2 nuts with the wrench, confirming that they were still tight, and you checked the spinning motion of the cowl by giving it a gentle push with your palm, feeling it turn freely on its bearing. The repair was complete. You remained on the roof for a moment longer than necessary, crouched against the railing with the rain streaming down your face, looking out at the grey expanse of the sea. From this height, the waves seemed smaller than they were, their true scale visible only when you watched the white foam at their crests and compared it to the known size of the rocks below. The horizon was invisible, lost in a haze of rain and spray that merged sea and sky into a single seamless grey, and the only movement in the world was the endless procession of waves marching toward the island and the slow turning of the ventilator cowl above your head. Then the cold began to seep through your wet clothing, and you turned away from the view and descended back through the hatch, pulling it closed behind you and latching it firmly. Back in the lantern room, you stripped off your wet jumper and hung it on a hook near the lamp pedestal, where the residual warmth from the pilot flame would dry it slowly. Your canvas apron was wet, too, and you untied it and laid it flat on the floor to drip. The tools went back into their pockets, and you wiped the monkey wrench dry with the clean rag before descending to the watchroom and then down to the ground floor to return the tools to their proper places in the pine chest. The whole repair had taken less than 30 minutes, and the tower was now slightly more whole than it had been before. A small improvement that no one would ever notice but that you knew had been made. The dampness of your clothing and the brief exposure to the wind had left you chilled, so you added another piece of driftwood to the stove and stood before it with your hands extended, letting the radiant heat warm your palms and wrists and face. The fire crackled softly, the driftwood popping as pockets of trapped salt heated and burst, and the smell of wood smoke mixed with the ever-present scent of kerosene to create the unique olfactory signature of the lighthouse interior. You made a fresh pot of tea while you stood there, going through the familiar motions of heating the pot and measuring the leaves and waiting the 4 minutes of steeping time. And when it was ready, you poured a mug and carried it up to the watchroom, ready for the next task on your mental list. The lens cleaning that you had performed at dawn was a daily maintenance ritual, but during storms the salt haze built up on the glass surfaces more quickly than usual, a fine white film of dried sea spray that diffracted the light and reduced the beam's sharpness. A second cleaning in the middle of the day was not strictly required by the regulations, but you had found through experience that it made a measurable difference in the quality of the light during the long storm nights, and so you had made it part of your own personal routine. You finished your tea, rinsing the mug and setting it in the rack, and then you climbed the 12 steps to the lantern room to attend to the great glass lens. The lens stood still and silent now, its rotation paused by the brake lever, and the grey daylight passing through the windows illuminated every prism and facet with a soft diffuse glow. You took the chamois cloth from its hook, the same cloth you had used that morning, and you inspected it carefully for any grit or debris that might scratch the glass. The cloth was clean, soft, and slightly oily to the touch, and you folded it into a pan that fit comfortably in your palm. Then you began the cleaning, starting at the top of the lens assembly and working your way around in the same slow circuit you had made at dawn. Each prism was a complex shape, a wedge of crown glass with curved and faceted surfaces designed to bend light at precise angles. The outer face of each prism was convex, curving outward like the lens of a magnifying glass, and this was the surface that collected the salt haze most readily, a faint white bloom that dulled the glass's clarity. You polished each outer face with a series of concentric circles, starting at the center and spiraling outward in a motion that your hand had memorized long ago. The pressure you applied was light but consistent, just enough to lift the salt film without risking any abrasion, and you counted the circles silently, 8 per prism, a number that ensured complete coverage without unnecessary repetition. The inner facets were more challenging to clean because they were set at angles that caught the light and made it difficult to see the salt haze directly. You had learned to check these surfaces by looking across them rather than at them, letting the light graze the glass at a shallow angle that revealed any imperfections as a faint milky sheen. Most of the facets were clean, the dawn cleaning having held up well, but a few on the seaward side had accumulated a fresh layer of salt from the wind-driven spray that found its way through the tiny gaps around the window frames. You polished these facets with the corner of the chamois, working the cloth into the angles with your fingertip, using the same light pressure and the same spiral motion, reduced in scale to fit the smaller surfaces. The central bullseye lens received the most attention because it was the heart of the optical system, the single largest piece of glass in the assembly, and any reduction in its clarity directly affected the beam's range. You unfolded the chamois and used a clean section of the cloth, holding it flat against the curved glass and polishing with long horizontal strokes that followed the lens's contour. The bullseye was thick, nearly 2 inches of solid glass at its center, and it had a faint greenish tint when viewed edge-on, the color of the iron impurities in the sand from which it had been made. You polished until the surface was flawless, checking your work by looking through the glass at the window beyond, and when you were satisfied you refolded the cloth and moved on to the smaller lenses in the upper and lower tiers. The upper lenses were catadioptric prisms, combining reflection and refraction to capture light that would otherwise escape upward and bend it back into the horizontal beam. These were smaller than the main prisms, but more numerous, arranged in rings above and below the central belt, and each one required its own moment of attention. You worked your way around the upper ring, then the lower, polishing each prism with the same number of circles and the same light pressure, your breath misting faintly on the glass as you leaned close to inspect your work. The process took the better part of an hour, a slow, methodical circuit of the entire lens assembly, and by the time you finished the chamois cloth was noticeably damp with the salt residue it had lifted, and your arms had acquired the mild ache of sustained, careful effort. You stepped back from the lens and looked at it as a whole, the way you might look at a completed job or a well-made piece of furniture. The glass gleamed with a clarity that seemed to generate its own light, the grey daylight passing through the prisms and emerging in faint rainbows that danced on the white ceiling. The lens was ready for the night, its crystal eye clear and perfect, and the thought gave you a quiet satisfaction that was entirely private and entirely sufficient. You hung the chamois cloth on its hook to dry, made a mental note to wash it properly when the storm ended, and then descended to the watchroom to record the cleaning in the logbook. The entry was brief, a single line noting the time and the fact of the second lens cleaning, but you added a small observation about the salt accumulation rate, a piece of data that might be useful for future storms. The barometer had stabilized, the needle holding steady at the same low reading for the past 2 hours, and you recorded that too, along with the wind direction and the sea state and the visibility, which remained poor but stable. The logbook was filling up with your neat rows of handwriting, a document that would be the only record of these 3 days, and you wrote each entry with the same careful attention you gave to the wick and the lens and the ventilator bolts. The afternoon stretched on, the grey light beginning its slow fade toward evening, and you settled into the chair beside the desk to wait out the remaining hours until the lighting ritual. The storm continued its steady work around you, the wind humming its bass note, the rain washing the windows, the sea marching toward the rocks in its endless ranks of waves. The tower was warm and quiet and solid, every bolt tight and every lens clean, and you were exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what you were supposed to do. The small repairs were finished, and the great crystal eye was ready for the dark. You set down the chamois cloth on its hook and stood for a moment in the center of the lantern room, the great lens silent and still around you, its prisms catching the grey afternoon light and holding it in faint suspended rainbows that moved across the white ceiling when you shifted your weight. The cleaning was done, the lens ready for the evening lighting, and the next scheduled task was not for another hour, a gap of open time that you might have filled with any number of small indoor duties, but that you decided, on this particular afternoon, to spend in observation. The storm had been blowing for a day and a half, and you had been so occupied with the interior routines of the tower that you had not yet stood still and simply watched the sea from the outside, feeling the wind and the spray and the full scale of the weather that wrapped your small island. You put on your still damp jumper, the wool cool and heavy against your arms, and you climbed the 12 steps to the lantern room door that led out onto the gallery. The gallery was a narrow iron walkway that encircled the lantern room, protected by a railing of stout iron bars set vertically into a top rail and a bottom plate. The whole construction painted a dark red that had faded over the years to the color of dried brick. The door was a heavy iron affair with a wheel lock that took 2 hands to turn, a mechanism designed to keep the sea out during the heaviest blows, and you spun the wheel until the dogs retracted and the door swung inward on its thick hinges. The wind rushed in immediately, a cold, wet presence that filled the lantern room with the smell of salt, and the sound of the storm made suddenly intimate, no longer filtered through glass and stone. You stepped out onto the gallery and pulled the door closed behind you, leaving it unlatched so you could return quickly, and then you stood with your back against the iron wall and let your senses adjust to the open air. The first thing you noticed was the sound, which was vastly larger out here, no longer a single humming note but a full orchestra of frequencies that came from every direction at once. The deep bass of the wind in the tower stays was still present, a foundation tone that vibrated through the ironwork and into the soles of your boots. But above it now, you could hear the higher frequencies, the hiss of the rain striking the sea surface, the percussive crash of waves against the rocks at the island's base, the whistle of air moving through the gallery railing, the occasional slap of a larger swell against the tower's stone foundation. Each sound occupied its own register, and together they formed a dense auditory fabric that you could not separate into individual threads, no matter how carefully you listened. The second thing you noticed was the cold, which was not the dry cold of a winter morning, but a wet, penetrating chill that moved through your jumper as if the wool were not there. The wind carried tiny droplets of seawater, not quite rain and not quite spray, a fine mist that beaded on your eyelashes and left a film of salt on your lips when you unconsciously licked them. You pulled the collar of your jumper higher and tucked your hands into the pockets of your trousers, and then you turned your attention to the sea itself, the reason you had come out here. The sea from the gallery was a different creature than the sea viewed through the lantern room windows. Seen through glass, the water was a picture, framed and contained, its violence reduced to a silent, moving image that you could turn away from at will. Out here on the gallery, with the wind pushing against your chest and the spray wetting your face, the sea was not a picture, but a presence. A living body of water that extended unbroken from the rocks below your feet to the shores of distant continents you would never see. Its scale was impossible to hold in your mind. The best you could do was to look at one small portion of it at a time, a patch of water the size of a field or a city block, and observe its particular qualities before moving your gaze to the next patch and the next, building a composite understanding from a series of local observations. The nearest water, the water that churned directly against the rocks at the base of the tower, was a color you thought of as slate green. It was not the green of grass or leaves, nor the blue-green of shallow tropical water, but a dense, opaque color, the that seemed to have grey and black mixed into its essence, a green that was almost a mineral color, the color of the slate tiles on a very old roof after rain. This green was produced by the combination of the dark rock beneath the water, the white foam churned into the surface by the breaking waves, and the grey light filtering down through the cloud layer. Three elements that combined to create a hue that shifted constantly as you watched, now a shade darker, now a shade lighter, never settling into a single stable tone. The foam itself was brilliant white, a sharp contrast to the dark water that carried it. It formed in long, ragged lines where the waves broke, and in swirling patches where the backwash from the rocks met the incoming swell, and in fine, delicate streamers that stretched out behind the crests of the largest waves like hair blowing in wind. The foam had a texture that you could see even from this height, a frothy, bubble-filled surface that caught the grey light and reflected it with a flat, matte whiteness. And it made a sound of its own, a low, continuous seething that underlay the deeper crashes of the breaking waves, the sound of millions of tiny bubbles bursting in sequence. Further out, beyond the immediate churn of the rocks, the water shifted to a deeper color, a gunmetal blue that was almost grey, but with a distinct cool undertone that marked it as ocean water rather than lake or river water. This color was the true color of the deep sea, the color produced by the absorption and scattering of light in pure salt water, and it was visible only in the troughs between waves, where the surface was briefly smooth before the next crest arrived. On the crests themselves, where the water was thinnest and most disturbed, the color lightened to a pale silver as the grey sky reflected off the foam-streaked surface, a metallic sheen that came and went with each passing wave. The waves themselves deserved a careful taxonomy, a classification that you had learned from the Lighthouse manual and refined through years of direct observation. The most basic distinction was between wind waves and swell. Wind waves were the waves being actively generated by the storm, short, steep waves with periods of 5 to 8 seconds, their crests sharp and often breaking, their shapes irregular and overlapping, produced by the wind that was blowing right now at this moment across the surface of the sea. Swell, on the other hand, consisted of waves that had been generated by distant weather systems and had traveled hundreds or thousands of miles to reach this shore, their periods longer and their shapes smoother, a deeper underlying rhythm that you could detect beneath the chaotic surface of the wind waves if you watched carefully enough. The wind waves today were the dominant feature, as they always were during a storm. They came from the north-northwest in a steady procession, rank after rank of dark water rising from the grey expanse, each wave slightly different from its neighbours, but all conforming to the same general pattern. A typical wave began as a low swell 100 yards out, a barely perceptible lifting of the surface that a casual observer might not notice. As it approached the shore, the shoaling effect of the rising seabed began to steepen its face. The water at the front of the wave slowing while the water at the back continued forward, compressing the wave into a taller and steeper shape. At a certain critical steepness, the crest became unstable and began to break, the top of the wave curling forward and collapsing into the trough ahead, producing a white cascade of foam that slid down the wave's face and spread out across the water behind it. The breaking process varied from wave to wave. Some waves broke with a clean spilling motion, the foam sliding smoothly down the front face in a continuous white curtain. Others broke with a plunging motion, the crest curling into a tube before smashing down onto the trough with a hollow boom that you felt as much as heard. A few of the largest waves broke with a surging motion, the whole mass of the wave rising up against the rocks and exploding upward in a vertical column of white water that hung in the air for a full second before gravity reclaimed it and pulled it back down into the churning froth at the rock's base. Each type of break had its own sound and its own visual signature, and you watched them come one after another, cataloguing their forms with the same attention you gave to the lens prisms or the barometer readings. The spray was a phenomenon unto itself, distinct from the rain and the foam and the waves. When a large wave struck the rocks at the island's base, the impact threw a sheet of water high into the air, a white curtain that rose 20 or 30 feet before the wind caught it and tore it apart into 1,000 individual droplets. These droplets did not fall immediately. The wind was strong enough to hold them aloft, to carry them horizontally across the island in great sweeping clouds of salt mist that you could see moving like ghosts across the scrub grass. The spray hung in the air for a surprisingly long time, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, sometimes more, its droplets so fine that they settled only gradually, drifting sideways rather than down. Watching the spray was like watching smoke, a slow-motion dance of water and air that had a hypnotic quality, and you found yourself following one particular cloud as it lifted from a wave impact, swept across the rocks, curled around the base of the tower, and finally dissipated against the stone wall 50 feet below your feet. The sea state, as defined by the Beaufort scale that you had memorized during your training, was currently Force 7, a near-gale producing seas that the manual described as high. Force 7 meant waves of 13 to 20 feet, their crests breaking into spindrift that streaked the surface in the direction of the wind, the whole sea a heaving mass of white and grey that made it difficult to distinguish individual waves from the general chaos. The manual's description was precise and useful, but it could not capture the particular quality of the sea at this moment. The way the foam streaked in long parallel lines that ran exactly with the wind direction, the way the larger waves seemed to rise up out of the grey with a slow inevitability that was almost dignified, the way the light shifted constantly as patches of thinner cloud moved overhead and allowed a fractional increase in the daylight. You thought of the other sea states, the ones you had seen in different weather and different seasons. Force 3, a gentle breeze, produced large wavelets with glassy crests that did not break, a sea that was pleasant to watch from the gallery on a summer afternoon. Force 5, a fresh breeze, produced moderate waves with many white caps and some spray, the point at which the sea began to look like work for any small boat caught out in it. Force 8, a full gale, produced moderately high waves with breaking crests that formed continuous streaks of foam, and the wind made a sound that was less like a hum and more like a roar. Force 10, a whole gale that you had experienced only twice in your career, produced very high waves with overhanging crests, the sea taking on a white appearance from the dense streaks of foam, the air so full of spray that visibility was reduced to near nothing. And Force 12, a hurricane that you hoped never to see, produced seas that the manual described simply as phenomenally high, a phrase whose restraint you had always appreciated. Today was Force 7, a near gale, serious but not dangerous, the kind of weather that tested the tower's construction and the keeper's routines without threatening to overwhelm either. You were grateful for that, and you stood at the railing with your hands gripping the cold iron and let the wind push against you while you continued to watch the water do its slow work. The sea was the same sea it had always been, the same sea that had worn down the rocks of this island over millennia, the same sea that sailors had crossed in wooden ships for centuries before the lighthouse was built, and it would continue its patient labor long after you and the tower and the light were gone, a thought that you found comforting rather than bleak. A particularly large set of waves arrived, a group of 5 or 6 that stood noticeably higher than the general run of seas, and you watched them approach with the same detached attention you gave everything else. The first wave of the set broke against the rocks with a crash that sent spray up past the level of the gallery, a fine salt mist that settled on your face and the front of your jumper, and the second wave was even larger, its crest curling into a perfect tube before it collapsed, a momentary sculpture of water that existed for less than a second and then was gone. The remaining waves of the set followed in decreasing size, and then the sea returned to its normal rhythm, the set having passed, its energy dissipated against the unyielding rock. You had been on the gallery for perhaps 20 minutes, and the cold was beginning to penetrate past your jumper and into your chest, a deep chill that you could feel settling into your bones. It was time to go back inside, to return to the quiet warmth of the tower and the familiar routines that waited there. You turned the wheel lock on the iron door, the metal cold and slick under your hands, and you stepped through into the lantern room, pulling the door closed behind you and spinning the wheel until the dogs engaged with a solid clunk. The sound of the storm dropped immediately, the higher frequencies cut off by the glass and stone, leaving only the deep humming bass that had become the background to your days. The temperature rose around you as if you had stepped into a warm bath. the still air of the lantern room wrapping around your chilled skin and beginning the slow work of driving the cold back out, and you stood for a moment just inside the door, letting the transition happen, feeling the sensation return to your fingers and the tips of your ears. The lens stood in the center of the room, clean and ready, its prisms gleaming in the grey light. The pilot flame burned with its tiny, steady teardrop, a point of warmth and color in the monochrome day. You descended to the watchroom where the clock ticked its steady measure and the barometer needle held at its low reading, and you sat at the desk to record your observations in the logbook. You wrote about the color of the sea, the slate green near the rocks, and the gunmetal blue further out, and you noted the sea state and the wave types and the way the spray hung in the air before falling. The pen moved across the page in its familiar rhythm, the ink drying quickly in the warm air, and when you finished the entry you closed the logbook and sat still for a moment, listening to the storm continue outside, a world of wet fury held at bay by stone and glass and iron, while you remained within, separate and warm and watching. Evening of the second day arrived with the same gradual dimming that had marked every transition of light since the storm began, a slow leaching of brightness from the grey sky that turned the watchroom windows from pale slate to deep charcoal over the course of an hour. You had been sitting at the desk for some time, the logbook open before you, the pen resting in the inkwell, while you waited for the clock to announce the hour and provide the occasion for a new entry. The barometer had been steady for most of the afternoon, but in the last half hour, the needle had stirred again, dropping a fraction of an inch with the same slow insistence that had characterized its movement since the supply boat left. You tapped the glass gently with your fingernail, a habit you'd acquired from an old keeper who swore it freed any stickiness in the mechanism, and the needle settled into its new position without a flicker, confirming the reading. The logbook entry that followed was a study in precision, the kind of writing that left no room for ambiguity, because ambiguity at sea could be fatal. You wrote the date first, though you had written it a dozen times already, each entry requiring its own heading. Then the time, taken from the ship's clock on the wall, 6 o'clock in the evening, the hour when you would normally be preparing the lamp for lighting, but which you had already prepared, an hour early because the darkness was coming faster now. Then the barometric pressure, copied from the brass dial with its needle pointing to a number that you had seen only a handful of times in your career, a low that spoke of deep cyclonic activity somewhere out in the Atlantic. Then the wind direction, still north, northwest, but with a slight backing toward true north that you had detected by watching the rain streak across the window glass at a slightly altered angle. Then the wind speed, estimated from the pitch of the wind in the iron stays, a high, steady whistle that told you the gale was holding at force 7, with occasional gusts that pushed toward force 8. Then the humidity, taken from the hygrometer on the wall, a simple instrument of hair and levers that indicated the air was nearly saturated. Then the visibility, which you described in the logbook as less than 200 yards, the sea and sky merging into a seamless grey void that the light could barely penetrate. Each letter was formed with a care that bordered on reverence. The pen was a simple dip pen with a steel nib that had been worn to your hand's particular angle, the tip slightly broadened on one side from years of rightward strokes. You dipped it in the inkwell every 2 or 3 words, touching the nib to the glass rim to remove the excess, and then you wrote with a light pressure that produced a fine, clean line, the ink flowing smoothly from the reservoir onto the cream-colored paper. The downstrokes were slightly thicker than the upstrokes, a natural product of the nib's flexibility, and the overall effect was of a copperplate hand that had been simplified by decades of practical use into something plainer but no less legible. You dotted each I and crossed each T with the same attention, and when you made a small error in the humidity figure, you did not scratch it out, but instead drew a single neat line through the number and wrote the correction above it, a practice required by the Lighthouse regulations that forbade erasures in official logs. The ink needed blotting after each few lines. You kept a sheet of pink blotting paper tucked into the back cover of the logbook, and you pressed it gently onto the wet script, rocking it once with your palm before lifting it away to reveal the now dry letters underneath. The blotting paper was already mottled with the mirrored ghosts of previous entries, reverse text that made no sense when you tried to read it, a palimpsest of all the hours you had spent at this desk. You replaced the blotter and resumed writing, adding a note about the lamp's condition and the oil consumption rate and the state of the clockwork, all the small technical details that would be meaningless to anyone but a lighthouse keeper, and that a lighthouse keeper would read with the same careful attention you were now giving to writing them. The clock on the wall ticked its steady mechanical tick, a sound so woven into the fabric of the watchroom that you heard it only when you chose to, the way you might choose to feel the pulse in your own wrist. It was a ship's clock, an 8-day movement in a brass and mahogany case, with a white enamel face and black Roman numerals, and a pair of ornate hands that moved with a slight stutter at each second's mark. The clock had been wound by the previous keeper before he left, and it would keep accurate time for another 6 days before needing attention, its mainspring slowly unwinding in its brass barrel, driving the escape wheel that rocked the pallets that released the power, one tooth at a time, a miniature version of the larger clockwork that turned the lens above. You looked up at the clock face as the minute hand clicked onto the 12, and then you waited while the mechanism gathered itself and struck the hour with 6 clear brass notes, each one a solid, predictable marker that divided the formless grey evening into measurable portions. The sound of the last strike faded into the background hum of the storm, and you returned your attention to the logbook. The entry was complete, 6 lines of careful script that recorded the state of the world at 6 o'clock on the second evening of the storm, and you sanded the page with the pounce pot to fix the last traces of damp ink, a fine dust of gun sandarac that you brushed away with a soft cloth before closing the book. The leather cover was warm from the lamplight, and you let your palm rest on it for a moment, feeling the grain of the hide and the slight bulge of the pages beneath, a physical record of your time on this station that would outlast your posting and the next, and the one after that. With the logbook closed and the hour marked, you turned your attention to the small tasks that filled the spaces between formal duties. The brass fittings in the watchroom had been accumulating a faint film of oil vapor and salt, a dullness that you noticed more in the lamplight than you had during the day, and so you took the tin of polishing compound from its shelf and a soft cotton rag from the drawer, and you began the slow work of restoring the metal to its proper gleam. The polishing compound was a pink paste that smelled faintly of ammonia and had the consistency of cold butter, and you applied it with the tip of your finger in small dabs, working it into the brass with circular motions that left a dark residue on the rag. The barometer case came first, its brass bezel and hanging loop, and the small plaque that bore the maker's name from a firm in London that had long since gone out of business. You polished each surface until the brass glowed with a deep golden luster, the kind of shine that seemed to hold light rather than merely reflect it. The clockwork casing was next, a larger and more complex surface with its glass panels and brass frames, and the small knobs that controlled the rotation speed. You worked around the glass carefully, polishing the frames without touching the panes, and then you polished the door handles and the ventilator controls and the lamp mount and the pen holder on the desk, moving through the watchroom in a slow circuit that left each brass surface gleaming. The work was repetitive but not tedious. It was the kind of work that allowed your mind to settle into a quiet rhythm, the motion of your hand on the rag matching the motion of the lens turning above, a slow circular dance that had no urgency and no end point except the satisfaction of a job well done. When the polishing was finished, you folded the rag and rinsed the pink residue from your hands in the small basin. The water was cold but clean, and you splashed it on your face as well, the chill a brief sharp sensation that refreshed your attention for the hours ahead. Then you turned to the rope locker, a small wooden chest beneath the desk that held the spare halyards and sheets for the fog signal and the flagstaff, coils of tarred hemp and manila that needed to be checked and recoiled periodically to prevent kinks and mildew. You opened the chest and lifted out the ropes one by one, laying them on the floor in long loops that you inspected by lamplight, running the fibers through your fingers to check for wear. The first rope was a length of 3-strand tarred hemp, about 40 feet long and half an inch in diameter, dark brown and slightly tacky to the touch. It smelled of pine tar and salt, a sharp, clean scent that rose from the coils as you handled them. You found no broken strands or chafed sections. so you began the process of coiling it anew, starting at one end and working your way toward the other with a smooth, continuous motion. The rope fell into neat concentric loops that you laid flat on the floor, each loop exactly the same diameter as the one before, a skill that your hands possessed without needing instruction from your mind. When the coil was complete, you secured it with a few turns of the end around the middle, a quick hitch that would keep the rope tidy until it was needed, and you replaced it in the chest. The second rope was manila, lighter in color and rougher in texture, used for the flagstaff halyard. You inspected it in the same way, inch by inch, your fingers sensitive to any variation in the fiber's consistency. The manila was in good condition, dry and sound, and you coiled it with the same even loops and returned it to the chest. The third rope was a short length of cotton sash cord used for small lashings, and you coiled that too, working through the entire contents of the rope locker until every line was inspected and stored, and the chest could be closed with the quiet thump of its wooden lid. The clock struck 7 while you were coiling the last rope, the 7 notes falling one after another in the warm quiet of the watchroom. You stood and stretched, your back arching slightly as you lifted your arms above your head, and then you climbed the 12 steps to the lantern room for the scheduled check. The lamp was burning as it had been since dusk, the flame a steady teardrop of gold inside its crystal heart, and you circled the lens slowly, watching the way the light played across the prisms and the way the wick consumed the oil with a faint hissing sound that was almost too quiet to hear. The rotation was steady, the mercury float turning without a whisper, the beam sweeping out into the rain with the same 8-second rhythm it had kept for hours now, a heartbeat of light that was the reason for your presence here. You stood beside the lamp and watched the wick burn. The flame was the color of a candle flame, but vastly brighter, a white gold cone that seemed to pull the darkness toward it and transform it into light. The edges of the flame shimmered slightly, a convection effect that produced faint ripples in the air above the chimney, and the mantle glowed with a steady incandescence that was the true source of the light, the rare earth oxides heated to a brilliant white by the burning oil. You adjusted the wick by the smallest fraction, a turn of the brass wheel that raised the cotton by perhaps a 64th of an inch, and the flame responded by brightening perceptibly, its color shifting from warm gold to a purer white. Satisfied, you returned the adjustment wheel to its original position and stood for a while longer, simply watching the flame exist in its glass house, a tiny sun that you had lit with your own hands. The 8 o'clock check followed the same pattern, the flame, the oil level, the rotation, the windows wiped free of condensation with a soft cloth. You recorded the check in the logbook with a single line, noting the time and the wick adjustment and the visibility, which had not changed. Then you settled into the chair beside the desk and let the evening stretch out around you, the hours unspooling with the slow regularity of the clock's ticking. You filled the time with other small acts, the spirit stove lit for another pot of tea, the tea leaves measured and steeped, the mug warmed by the first pour before you filled it. The tea was hot and strong, and you drank it in slow sips while the wind hummed its bass note and the rain fell in undulating curtains. At 9 o'clock, the clock struck again, and you performed another check. The lamp was still burning, the flame still steady, the oil still feeding through the day tank at the expected rate. You noted the time in the logbook and added a brief observation about the sea state, which you could not see but could hear as a low thunder of breaking waves below the wind's hum. The tower was holding its own against the weather, every stone and bolt and glass pane doing its duty, and you felt a quiet kinship with the structure around you, a sense of shared purpose that required no words. The 10 o'clock hour arrived with its 10 measured strikes, and you performed the check with the same care as all the others, the ritual so familiar that your hands moved through it without conscious direction. The wick needed another small trim, a dark crust forming on one side that you snicked away with the curved scissors, catching the fragment in the tin cup. The flame straightened and brightened, and you stood for a minute watching it, the golden teardrop that never wavered, never flickered, never failed. Then you descended to the watchroom and sat again at the desk, opening the logbook to record the trim and the time, the ink flowing from the pen in its neat lines, the blotter pressing, the sand scattering, the page turning as you reached the end of the sheet and began a fresh one, the old page covered now with the record of the day's hours, each one accounted for, each one marked by a small act of attention and care. The clock ticked toward 11, and you thought about the nature of timekeeping, the way that the logbook and the clock and the rotation of the lens all served the same fundamental purpose: to impose order on the formless flow of hours, to divide the great dark expanse of a storm night into manageable portions, each one requiring only a small set of actions, a check and a trim and a note, nothing more. The storm would end eventually, the wind would drop, the sun would return, and the logbook would show exactly what had happened during every hour of its passage, a record so complete that anyone reading it could reconstruct the entire 3 days in precise detail. That was the purpose of the log, and that was the purpose of the clock, and that was the purpose of your presence here, to witness and to record, to be the consciousness that turned weather into history. The 11 o'clock hour struck, 11 brass notes that seemed louder in the deep quiet of the watchroom, and you rose to perform the check again. The same actions in the same order, the same golden flame burning in its crystal heart, the same beams sweeping out into the same rain. You would do this again at midnight, and again at 1, and again at 2, all through the long dark hours until dawn came with its slow grey lightning, and then you would extinguish the lamp and begin the day's duties, the winding and the cleaning and the polishing and the coiling, the endless round of small tasks that made up the life of a lighthouse keeper during a storm. And you would log each hour, each action, each observation, filling the pages with your careful script, because that was the work, and you were the one to do it. The descent from the watchroom to the ground floor was a journey into a different kind of quiet, one that deepened with each turn of the spiral stair. Up above, the storm spoke through the ironwork in a constant baritone hum, the wind and rain pressing against the lantern room glass as if the weather were a living thing trying to find a way in. Down here, at the bottom of the tower, the sound of the storm became a distant rumble, felt more through the soles of your boots than heard with your ears, a low vibration that lived in the stone itself. You stepped off the last iron tread and onto the packed earth and flagstone floor of the ground floor room, and the change in acoustic was immediate, as if you had descended not just 47 steps, but into an entirely separate building. The ground floor room was circular, perhaps 15 feet across, its curved walls painted with a cream-colored lime wash that had darkened over the years to the color of old parchment. The light here came from a single oil lamp mounted on a bracket beside the stove, its flame turned low, and from the soft orange glow of the firebox visible through the stove's small mica window, the driftwood within having burned down to a bed of glowing coals that shifted now and then with a faint tinkling sound. The room was warm, warmer than the watchroom had been, the heat from the stove collecting in the stone walls and radiating back slowly, a stored warmth that made the space feel inhabited and safe. You stood for a moment in the center of the room, letting your eyes adjust to the dimness after the brighter lamp of the watchroom. The furniture arranged itself around you in a familiar pattern, the work table against the north wall, with its scrubbed pine surface and its single wooden stool tucked beneath, the iron stove against the east wall with its flue pipe rising straight up through the ceiling, the sink and the small hand pump against the west wall, and against the south wall the storage shelves that held the everyday supplies, the plates and mugs and the tinned goods that you used for your meals. The sleeping alcove was a dark rectangle cut into the thickness of the northeast wall, its curtain drawn back, the iron bedstead visible as a shadow within a shadow. The storeroom door was set into the curved wall behind the stove, a low arched opening with a wooden door that you kept latched but never locked. You crossed the room in 4 strides, your boots making a soft scuffing sound on the flagstones, and you lifted the latch with your thumb. The door swung inward on leather hinges that made no sound, and the smell of the storeroom came out to meet you. Lamp oil and burlap, dried herbs and old wood, the cool mineral scent of the stone walls, and the faint sweetness of the apples you had stored in a barrel 2 months ago and were still eating one by one. It was a complex smell, layered and deep, and it changed slightly each time you entered, depending on the temperature and the humidity and which supplies had been used most recently. The storeroom was not a large space. It had been carved from the thickness of the tower's outer wall and extended only about 8 feet in each direction. A rough rectangle with a ceiling so low you had to stoop slightly when standing near the edges. The walls were bare stone, the original granite blocks of the tower's foundation, their surfaces rough and cool to the touch, glistening faintly with the natural moisture that seeped through the mortar during long storms. A single small window set high in the outer wall let in a grey square of light during the day, but now it was dark outside, and the window showed only blackness, its glass streaked with rain that caught the faint glow from the ground floor lamp and turned it into tiny moving lines of silver. You lit the small hand lamp that hung from a hook just inside the door, adjusting its wick to a steady flame that pushed back the shadows and revealed the contents of the room in a warm yellow circle. The storeroom was organized with the same methodical precision that you apply to everything else. Everything had its place, and every place was known. The left wall was given over to the dry goods, the flour and the sugar and the beans and the rice, all stored in heavy burlap sacks that rested on wooden pallets to keep them off the damp floor. The right wall held the oil stores, the green tinplate cans arranged in their wooden rack in neat rows, each one identical to its neighbor, their painted surfaces gleaming dully in the lamplight. The back wall held the crocks and barrels, the earthenware jars of pickled vegetables, and the small cask of salt pork, and the barrel of apples that had been waxed and wrapped individually, and were still firm and sweet after 2 months of careful storage. You began with the flour sacks, as you always did when you came down here. There were 3 of them, each holding 50 pounds of stone-ground wheat flour, their tops rolled down in tight cuffs and tied with cotton twine. The burlap was coarse under your fingers, a rough weave of jute fibers that had been stained and softened by years of handling, and the smell of the flour seeped through it, a dry, dusty scent that made you think of the bakery on the mainland, where the bread you had eaten for breakfast had been baked. You checked the twine on each sack, making sure the knots were still tight and the cuffs still rolled, and then you pressed your palm flat against the side of each sack, feeling the soft give of the flour inside, the way it yielded to pressure and then held its shape when you removed your hand. The flour was dry, no lumps or hard spots that would indicate moisture had gotten in, and you were satisfied. The sugar was stored in a smaller sack, perhaps 20 pounds, its burlap a finer weave than the flour sacks, and its contents a pale brown rather than white, a raw sugar that had been minimally refined and still carried a faint aroma of molasses. You checked its knot and its cuff, and then you pressed your palm against its side, feeling the granular texture of the sugar shift under your hand, a soft crunching sensation that was entirely different from the smooth give of the flour. Beside the sugar stood the sack of dried beans, navy beans, small and white and hard as pebbles, their texture through the burlap, a loose aggregate of individual shapes rather than a single uniform mass. You checked each sack in turn, the rice and the lentils and the split peas, each one a different texture, a different weight, a different sound when you shifted it on its pallet. The oil stores were next, and you turned to face the wooden rack that held the green tinplate cans. There were 16 of them, as you had counted 2 days ago, arranged in 2 rows of 8, their rectangular shapes fitting together with the precision of bricks in a wall. Each can was identical, a gallon of refined lamp oil sealed with a soldered cap, its surface painted a dark olive green that had been standardized by the Lighthouse service so that oil cans could be recognized anywhere in the world. You lifted one of the cans from its slot, feeling its weight settle into your hand, a solid heft that spoke of fullness. The can was cool to the touch, the tin plate conducting the storeroom's chill, and you checked its seams with your fingertip, running it along the solid edges where the sides met the top and bottom. The seams were intact, no leaks or weeping, and you returned the can to its slot and lifted the next one, repeating the inspection with the same slow care. The lamp oil had a particular visual quality that you had always appreciated. When held up to the lamplight, the cans seemed almost to glow from within, their contents a deep amber liquid that was the color of strong tea or dark honey. You thought of the oil as the lighthouse's lifeblood, a stored energy that would be transformed into light over the coming nights, and the rows of cans seemed to you like a regiment of soldiers standing at attention, each one ready to serve its purpose when called upon. You finished checking the oil cans and then turned to the open can that sat on the floor beside the rack, the one you had been drawing from to refill the day tank. Its cap was loose, a replacement screw cap that allowed you to pour without fully opening the seal, and you checked that it was tight and that no oil had pooled beneath it. The back wall of the storeroom held the earthenware crocks, a collection of brown and grey vessels in varying sizes that had been made by a potter in the nearest coastal village and were now darkened and stained by years of use. The largest crock, nearly 3 feet tall and wide enough that you could not wrap your arms around it, held the pickled cabbage that you had helped prepare during the autumn, layers of shredded cabbage packed in salt and left to ferment into a sour, crunchy preserve that would last through the winter. The crock had a heavy stone lid that fit into a groove around its rim, sealed with a layer of melted beeswax that you had poured yourself, and you checked the wax seal now, running your fingertip along its edge to make sure no cracks had formed. The wax was intact, slightly tacky to the touch, and the faint vinegary smell that escaped from the seal was the smell of a successful fermentation. Beside the cabbage crock stood a smaller crock of salted butter, its surface a pale yellow beneath the thin layer of salt that covered it. You lifted the wooden lid and peered inside, noting that the butter had not melted or separated despite the warmth of the tower. And then you pressed the lid back into place and moved on to the salt pork barrel, a small oak cask with iron hoops that held chunks of pork belly packed in coarse salt. The barrel was heavy and you did not move it, but you checked the brine level by tilting it slightly, hearing the liquid slosh inside, a sound that confirmed the pork was still fully submerged and would keep for months. The inventory took perhaps 40 minutes, a slow methodical circuit of every shelf and every sack and every container in the room, and when it was finished, you had confirmed what you already knew. The stores were full and sound, the tower was provisioned for weeks beyond the storm's expected duration, and there was nothing here that needed your attention or your repair. You blew out the hand lamp and hung it back on its hook, and then you stepped out of the storeroom and closed the door behind you, the latch falling into place with a soft click that was almost lost in the deeper hum of the wind. The ground floor room seemed brighter after the darkness of the storeroom, the single oil lamp casting a warm circle of light that pooled on the flagstones and climbed the curved walls. You stood for a moment deciding what to do next, and your eyes fell on the broom that leaned against the wall beside the sink. The broom was an old one, its wooden handle worn smooth and dark by the grip of many hands, its bristles made of stiff corn straw bound together with wire and trimmed to a flat edge. The bristles had softened at the tips from years of sweeping, and they made a particular sound when they moved across the stone floor, a gentle hushing that was more like the sound of the sea than the sound of a cleaning tool. You took the broom from its corner and began to sweep. Sweeping the ground floor room was not a task that the regulations required, nor was it a task that made any practical difference to the lighthouse's operation. The floor was flagstone and packed earth, and it accumulated very little dirt from day to day, only the occasional crumb from the work table or a few grains of salt that fell from your boots after a trip to the gallery. But sweeping was part of the rhythm of the tower, a small act of maintenance that kept the space feeling inhabited and orderly, and you performed it with the same attention you gave to the lens or the logbook. You started at the outer edge of the room, where the floor met the curved wall, and you worked your way inward in a slow spiral, drawing the broom toward you in long, steady strokes that gathered the invisible dust into a small pile at the center. The bristles made their soft, hushing sound against the stone, a sound that blended with the distant hum of the storm and the faint crackle of the coals in the stove and the creak of the tower's timbers as they adjusted to the wind's pressure. The handle of the broom was warm where your hands held it, the wood having absorbed the room's heat, and the motion of sweeping was a gentle repetitive exercise that loosened your shoulders and slowed your breathing. You swept the flagstones beneath the work table, crouching to reach the corners, and then you swept the packed earth in front of the stove, where the heat had baked the soil to a hard, smooth surface that the bristles barely marked. The pile of dust at the center of the room was tiny, a few teaspoons of pale grey powder that you collected with the dustpan and emptied into the stove, where it vanished into the coals without a sound. With the floor swept and the broom returned to its corner, you washed your hands in the small basin, working the pump handle until a stream of cold fresh water splashed into the ceramic bowl. The water came from the cistern beneath the tower, a large tank that collected rainwater from the roof and filtered it through layers of sand and charcoal, and it was cold and clean, and tasted faintly of the minerals it had dissolved from the stone. You drank a cupped handful, the chill shocking your teeth, and then you dried your hands on the cloth that hung beside the basin and considered what to do next. The tear in your wool jumper had been bothering you for the better part of a week, a small rip in the left sleeve where the cuff met the forearm, probably caused by catching the sleeve on a rough edge of the iron stair railing. The tear was no longer than your thumbnail, a clean separation of the knitted fibers that had not yet begun to unravel, but would, you knew, if left unattended. Mending was an evening task, something to do in the quiet hours between lamp checks, and the ground floor room with its warm stove and its soft lamplight seemed the right place for it. You retrieved the small sewing kit from its drawer in the work table, a flat tin box that had once held shortbread and now held needles and thread and a small pair of scissors and a wooden darning egg, and you sat on the stool beside the stove, angling yourself so that the light from the lamp fell across your hands. The needle you selected was a medium-sized darner with a blunt tip and a large eye, a needle designed for working with wool rather than cotton, and you threaded it with a length of dark grey yarn that matched the colour of your jumper closely enough that the mend would be nearly invisible. The yarn was slightly finer than the jumper's own wool, a two-ply twist that you had spun yourself from the fleece of the island's few sheep during the long summer evenings, and it had a softness and a springiness that made it pleasant to work with. You held the sleeve close to the lamp and examined the tear, turning the fabric over to see how the fibers had parted, and then you began to sew. The stitch you used was a simple overcast stitch, the needle passing through the fabric on one side of the tear and then crossing over to the other side, drawing the edges together with a gentle tension that closed the gap without puckering the fabric. Each stitch was small and even, perhaps 1/8 of an inch long, and you placed them in a neat row that followed the line of the tear from one end to the other. The needle passed through the wool with a slight resistance, the fibers parting around the steel with a soft whisper, and the yarn pulled through with a faint rasping sound that was the only noise in the room besides the stove and the storm. You worked slowly, without hurry, because mending was not a task to be rushed. Rushing produced uneven stitches and pulled threads and a mend that would fail after a few wearings, requiring the work to be done again. Better to do it once, slowly, and have it last. When you reached the end of the tier, you made 3 small back stitches to secure the thread, the needle passing through the same holes twice in succession, and then you cut the yarn close to the fabric with the small scissors from the tin. The mend was neat and strong, a line of dark grey stitches that blended into the jumper's weave and would be noticed only if someone looked very closely, which no one ever did. You turned the sleeve right side out again and ran your thumb over the stitches, feeling the slight ridge they made against the surrounding fabric, and then you folded the jumper and set it aside, the small task complete. The stove had burned low again while you sewed, the coals settling into a bed of orange embers that pulsed faintly with the draught from the chimney. You added another piece of driftwood, a twisted branch of pale grey wood that had been worn smooth by the sea and bleached by the sun, and you watched as the flames licked up around it, finding the dry fibers and consuming them with a soft crackling sound. The warmth radiated outward, filling the room with a drowsy heat that made your eyelids heavy, and you sat for a while longer on the stool, listening to the storm continue its slow work outside, while the tower held you in its stone embrace, safe and still and quiet, deep in the belly of the enduring thing that was your home and your duty, and your world. You came up through the trapdoor into the lantern room at 2:15 in the morning, the hand lamp swinging gently from your fingers, its flame a small yellow companion in the vast dark of the upper tower. The storm had reached what felt like its deepest hour, that still point in the cycle of a gale when the wind no longer gusted or shifted, but held a single unwavering note, a baritone hum that seemed to come from every direction at once and vibrated in the iron floor plates under your boots. The lantern room was warm from the lamp that had been burning since dusk, the great flame steady inside its turning lens, and the air smelled of hot brass and mineral oil and the faint ozone tang of the lightning that flickered far out over the sea, too distant for thunder, but close enough to pulse briefly in the corner of your eye. You had completed the 2 o'clock check with the same quiet precision as all the checks before it, the wick trimmed and the oil level noted, and the logbook entry written in your careful hand. Now there was nothing required of you until the 4 o'clock check, a gap of nearly 2 hours that fell in the deepest part of the night, when the world outside was a uniform black, so complete that the windows showed nothing but your own reflection staring back at you, a pale face suspended in a void. This was the middle watch, the hours that the old keepers called the long dark, and you had learned over years of service that the best way to pass them was not to fight wakefulness nor to court sleep, but to settle into a state of quiet attention, a watchfulness without urgency, and let the hours flow past like water around a stone. The watch chair sat against the curved wall of the lantern room, a simple wooden armchair with a high back and a flat seat cushioned by a folded blanket, positioned so that you could see the lamp and the windows and the clockwork mechanism all from the same spot. You had dragged it into this position on your first day at the station, and it had remained here ever since, its legs leaving faint marks on the iron floor that you noticed every time you swept and never bothered to clean. Beside the chair stood a small wooden stool that served as a side table, and on it you had placed a mug of tea that had long since gone cold, and the pocket notebook in which you jotted observations between formal log entries. You took the second blanket from its hook on the wall, a thick grey wool blanket with a frayed edge that someone had hemmed with blue thread many years ago, and you wrapped it around your shoulders, settling into the chair with your back against the high wooden slats and your feet flat on the floor. The lamp burned on inside its crystal heart, the flame a white gold teardrop that seemed almost solid in its steadiness, and the lens turned around it with the soft whisper of glass floating on mercury, a sound so faint you could hear it only in the stillness between gusts of wind. The clockwork mechanism below transmitted its motion upward through the drive shaft, and every few seconds there was a soft click as the rotation gear engaged the next tooth of the main wheel, a sound as regular as a heartbeat and nearly as quiet. You sat in the chair and let these sounds wash over you, the hiss of the mantle and the whisper of the lens and the click of the gear and the deep hum of the wind, all of them together forming a mechanical lullaby that had no melody, but held a rhythm you could feel in your chest. The darkness outside was not uniform, you noticed, if you looked at it long enough. When you first sat down, the windows were sheets of absolute black, the glass reflecting the lamp flame back at you, so that you saw a dozen tiny fires dancing in the panes. But as your eyes adjusted to the dimness, you began to perceive variations in the blackness, subtle distinctions that had no color, but differed in depth and texture. The sea was a moving darkness, a restless black that shifted and churned, its surface visible only because the foam on the wave crests caught a faint glimmer from the lighthouse beam, a phosphorescence of reflected light that appeared and vanished with each passing swell. The sky was a still darkness, a flat black that seemed heavier than the sea, pressing down from above with a weight you could almost feel. And the rain was a streaking darkness, a diagonal slant of slightly lighter black that crossed the windows in continuous rivulets, its motion the only visible thing in a world otherwise without form. You pulled the blanket tighter around your shoulders and let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of the lens, the 8-second cycle of light and dark that you had been living inside for 2 days now. The watch chair had grown familiar to your body, its wooden contours known to every vertebrae, and you settled into it with the ease of a creature returning to its nest. The cold tea sat forgotten on the stool, a thin skin forming on its surface, and the pocket notebook lay close beside it, the stub of pencil marking the page where you had written the 2 o'clock barometer reading. You did not need to write anything now. This was the time for watching, not recording, a passive attentiveness that required no action and left no trace. Time behaved strangely during the middle watch. The minutes did not pass in the orderly sequence that the clock in the watchroom insisted upon. Instead, they seemed to pool and stretch, to slow down and then to stop entirely, so that an hour in the chair felt like a single long moment that had no beginning and no end. You had experienced this phenomenon many times before, and you no longer fought it or even noticed it particularly. It was simply the way time moved in the deep night, a different viscosity than the time of daylight hours, and you let yourself drift within it without resistance. Your thoughts drifted too, unmoored from the immediate tasks that occupied your waking mind. You thought about the previous keepers who had sat in this same chair, watching this same lamp, listening to this same wind. Their names were written in the front of the logbook, a list that went back 60 years to the first keeper, a man named McAllister, who had lit the original oil lamp with a handmade wick and a flint striker. You had read his entries, the ink now brown with age, the handwriting a spidery cursive that was difficult to decipher, but that recorded the same observations you recorded: wind speed and barometer and sea state and the time of lighting and extinguishing. McAllister had sat through storms just like this one, wrapped in a blanket just like this one, listening to the same click of the rotation gear, and the thought gave you a sense of continuity that was comforting in its impersonality. A connection to a long chain of keepers that stretched back to the first fire, lit on the first headland. The lamp flame flickered once, the slightest waver, and your attention snapped back to the present with the instantaneous alertness that years of night watches had trained into you. You leaned forward in the chair, watching the flame, but it steadied immediately, the flicker having been caused by a small bubble of air in the oil feed line, a minor disruption that resolved itself without intervention. You noted the flicker in the pocket notebook, a single word and the time, and then you leaned back in the chair and let your attention soften again. The lamp would burn for hours yet, the oil in the day tank sufficient for the rest of the night, and the wick was trimmed, and the mantle was sound, and the rotation was steady. There was nothing to do but wait. The first change came so gradually that you almost did not notice it. The darkness outside the windows, which had been absolute for hours, began to soften at its edges, the black lightening by a fraction so small that you could not have measured it with any instrument. It was not yet grey, not even charcoal. It was simply a less complete black, a darkness that had lost some of its depth, as if someone had breathed on a mirror and left the faintest film of moisture that scattered the light just enough to make the void seem slightly less empty. You noticed this change not with your eyes but with some other sense, a perception that lived in the back of your mind and that had been trained by years of watching dawns arrive over the sea. The night was turning, and even though the actual sunrise was still hours away, the process had begun. You sat very still in the chair and watched the windows. The change was so slow that you could not see it happening in real time. You could only compare the present moment to your memory of the moment 10 minutes before, holding both images in your mind and noting the difference. 10 minutes ago, the sea had been invisible. Now there was a faint texture to the darkness where the sea was, a barely perceptible differentiation between the moving black of the water and the still black of the sky. The horizon, which had been a concept rather than a visible thing, was beginning to exist as a distinction, a line so faint it was more of a suggestion, a place where the quality of the darkness changed. You watched this line emerge from the void with the patience of someone who had no expectation of speed, and the line slowly became slightly more present, slightly more real, as the minutes accumulated and the light from the hidden sun began its long journey through the cloud layers. The sequence of greys was a progression you had catalogued many times, a slow unfolding of color from the absolute black of midnight to the pale silver of a stormy noon, and each stage had its own character and its own duration. The first stage, the one you were watching now, was the charcoal stage, when the black softened into a dark grey that had no blue in it yet, a flat neutral tone like the colour of a pencil drawing that had been heavily shaded. In this stage the sea became visible as a moving surface, a restless grey that shifted and churned, and the clouds became visible as a lowering ceiling, a darker grey against the slightly lighter grey of the sky behind them. The foam on the wave crests began to show as a paler grey, almost white in comparison to the water, and the rain streaks on the windows became visible, not as light, but as motion, a continuous downward flow that caught the charcoal light and bent it slightly. You shifted in the chair, adjusting the blanket around your shoulders, and you continued to watch. The charcoal stage lasted perhaps 40 minutes, the grey deepening and lightening in imperceptible increments, and then it began to shift into the second stage, the ash grey that was the colour of wood, ash after a fire has burned all night. This grey had a softer quality than the charcoal, a powdery diffused tone that seemed to fill the air rather than simply colour it, and it brought with it the first hints of detail. The shape of individual waves became visible now, not just the general texture of the sea, and you could see the larger rocks at the base of the tower as dark shapes against the grey foam. The rain remained a continuous wash, but you could now see the individual drops hitting the window glass, 1,000 tiny impacts that merged into the familiar pattern of the storm. The lamp flames seemed to shrink as the ash grey lightened, its yellow glow becoming less dominant as the outside world reasserted its presence. The lens still turned, the beam still swept out across the sea, but the light now looked thinner and paler, its reach reduced by the growing daylight. Soon it would be time to extinguish the lamp, but not yet. The regulations specified that the light should burn until the visibility was sufficient for natural illumination, and the visibility was still poor, the rain and the spray and the low cloud combining to keep the day dim and grey. You would wait for the pearl stage, the third and final grey before the true dawn, when the light took on a luminous quality that seemed to come from within the clouds rather than from the sun behind them. The pearl stage arrived after another half-hour of gradual lightening, the ash grey warming slightly and gaining a faint iridescence that you had always found beautiful. It was not a colour that could be described easily. It was grey with a hint of silver, grey with a hint of lavender, grey that seemed to glow softly from within like the inside of an oyster shell. In this light, the sea took on a polished quality, its surface a moving sheet of silver grey that reflected the pearl sky, and the foam on the waves was a brilliant white that seemed almost luminous. The horizon, which had been a vague line between darker and lighter, now became a distinct boundary, a clean separation of sea and sky that stretched across the full arc of the windows, unbroken and sharp. You could see the waves marching in from the north-northwest, their ranks stretching back to the edge of visibility, and you could see the rain falling in distinct curtains that moved across the sea in slow procession, one after another, as far as the horizon itself. You rose from the chair for the first time in nearly 2 hours, the blanket slipping from your shoulders, and you walked to the window on the seaward side of the lantern room. The glass was cold under your palm, and the view through it was the same view you had seen 100 times from this spot, but it never lost its capacity to hold your attention. The pearl-grey sea heaved and churned, the waves still high and steep, their crests blowing off in white streamers of spray that the wind carried horizontally across the surface. The rain was easing slightly, its intensity diminishing as the storm began the slow process of winding down, though the wind still held its deep baritone note, and the tower still vibrated with the force of it. The horizon was a clean line now, a dark grey band where the sea met the sky, and above it the clouds were beginning to show structure, layers of lighter and darker grey that moved at different speeds, the lower clouds racing before the wind while the higher clouds drifted more slowly, their shapes changing gradually as you watched. You stood at the window for a long time, watching the first true dawn of the third day arrive as a slow brightening of the pearl grey into a pale silver that was almost white. The sun was somewhere above the cloud layer, invisible but present, its light filtering down through the moisture and the vapour to create a diffuse illumination that had no source and no shadow. The rain continued to fall, but it was lighter now, a steady drizzle rather than the driving sheets of the night before, and the sea was beginning to show flecks of a deeper colour in the troughs between waves, a hint of the green that you knew would return when the storm finally cleared. The horizon held steady, a line that separated the world into its two great halves, and you watched it without expectation, letting the slow progress of the dawn fill your attention until the 4 o'clock hour arrived and the clock in the watchroom below struck its 4 brass notes, calling you back to your duties and the start of another day. Sometime in the early afternoon of the third day, the barometer needle began to move. You had been sitting at the desk in the watchroom, the logbook open to a fresh page, the pen idle in your hand while you listened to the wind and waited for the clock to mark the hour. The needle had been holding steady at its low reading for so long that you would almost stop checking it between regular observations, but a flicker of movement in the brass dial caught the edge of your vision and drew your attention. You leaned forward, resting your elbows on the desk, and watched as the needle rose by a fraction of a division, paused, and then rose again. A slow, steady climb that was the mirror image of its fall 2 days before. The storm was beginning to unwind. You tapped the barometer glass gently with your knuckle, the old habit, and the needle responded with a small quiver before resuming its upward progress. The reading was still low by any normal standard, the pressure that of a deep depression, but the direction of the change had reversed, and that was what mattered. You recorded the new reading in the logbook with the time and a brief note, barometer rising, the first such entry since the supply boat had disappeared into the mist. The ink dried quickly in the warm air, and you blotted it and sanded it, and sat back in the chair, listening to the wind with a new attention, waiting for the sound to confirm what the instrument had promised. The wind did not drop all at once. It was not in the nature of storms to end suddenly. They unwound themselves in gradual stages, each one a slight relaxation of the pressure that had been driving the sea and the air for the past 2 days. The first change you noticed was a subtle shift in the note the wind made as it moved through the iron stays. The deep baritone hum that had been a constant presence since the first night began to waver, losing its steady pitch and breaking into longer gusts separated by intervals of relative quiet. During the gusts, the wind still howled with the same ferocity, pressing against the tower with a weight you could feel in the floor plates, but between gusts there were now moments of calm, brief pauses when the pressure eased and the tower seemed to exhale. You stood up from the desk and walked to the window, looking out at the sea with the expectation of seeing some corresponding change in the waves. The sea was always slower to respond than the wind. It had been worked into a fury over 2 days and would take time to subside. The waves were still high, their crests blowing off in white streamers of spray, but there was a difference in their quality that you could not quite name. A slight rounding of their peaks, a marginal lengthening of the interval between them. The foam streaks that had covered the surface in a continuous white net were beginning to break apart, leaving patches of dark water visible between them. The rain was still falling, a steady diagonal wash against the glass, but it was lighter now, the drops smaller and less dense, no longer driven with the stinging force of the gale's full strength. You returned to the desk and wrote another log entry, describing the wind's new pattern and the first signs of moderation in the sea state. Then you made a decision that had been waiting in the back of your mind since the barometer began to rise. You would use this lull, this beginning of the storm's end, to perform a thorough cleaning of the tower's brass and glass, removing the salt-laden moisture that had been driven into every crevice by 2 days of wind-driven spray. The routine cleaning you had done each day was maintenance, enough to keep the light functioning, but the storm's conclusion called for a deeper attention, a restoration of the tower to its pre-storm condition. You began in the lantern room, climbing the 12 steps with a bucket of fresh water and a collection of cloths and brushes and the tin of polishing compound. The room was still dominated by the turning lens and the burning lamp, the flame pale and small in the grey afternoon light, and the windows were still streaked with rain and salt, but the quality of the light had changed. It was a lighter grey now, a grey with a hint of silver at its edges, and the shadows in the corners of the room were less deep. You set the bucket down beside the lamp pedestal and took up the first cloth. The brass in the lantern room was extensive. The lamp pedestal itself, a heavy bronze casting with fluted columns and ornate brackets, the oil feed pipes that ran from the day tank to the burner, the rotation gear housing, the window frames with their bronze mullions and transoms, the ventilator controls and the door hinges and the gallery rail that circled the outside. Every one of these surfaces had been coated with a fine film of salt and oil vapor, a sticky grey residue that dulled the metal's natural gleam, and, if left too long, would begin to pit the surface with corrosion. You dipped the cloth in the fresh water and wrung it out, then began to wipe. The wiping was a slow, methodical process, each surface receiving the same attention, the same number of passes with the damp cloth, followed by a dry cloth to remove any remaining moisture. You worked around the room in a systematic circuit, starting at the lamp pedestal and moving outward. The brass of the pedestal was warm from the lamp's heat, and the salt residue came away easily, dissolving in the water and leaving the metal bright. You wiped the fluted columns with the cloth wrapped around your finger, getting into the grooves where the salt had accumulated in thin white lines, and you wiped the brackets and the oil pipes in the rotation gear housing, each part emerging from its grey film with a deep golden shine that caught the grey light and held it. The window frames required a different approach because the salt buildup was heavier there, a crusty white deposit that had been driven into the corners by the wind. You used a small, stiff, bristled brush to loosen the crust, working it gently so as not to scratch the bronze, and then you wiped the loosened salt away with the damp cloth. The water in the bucket turned grey and then brown as you rinsed the cloth, and you changed it twice during the course of the cleaning, carrying the bucket down the stairs to the ground floor sink and refilling it with fresh water from the cistern. When the brass in the lantern room was clean and gleaming, you turned your attention to the lens. The daily cleanings had kept the prisms clear of salt, but the storm had been unusually persistent, and you wanted to examine every surface carefully for any scratches or chips that might have been caused by wind-driven debris. The lens was still turning, the 8-second rotation continuing its steady rhythm, and you stopped it with the brake lever so that you could work without the movement. The great glass assembly stood silent and still in the grey light, its prisms and bullseye lenses a frozen cascade of crystal. You took the chamois cloth and began at the top, examining each prism as you cleaned it. The examination was a slow business, requiring you to hold each piece of glass at different angles to the light, checking for any flaws that might refract the beaming correctly. You found nothing, as you had expected. The lens was built to withstand far worse weather than this storm had produced, its glass thick and well mounted in bronze frames that absorbed vibration without transmitting it to the prisms. But the act of checking was part of the ritual, a thoroughness that left nothing to chance, and you worked your way down through the upper rings and the central belt and the lower rings, polishing each piece and examining it and moving on to the next. The bullseye lens at the center of the assembly received extra attention, its thick curved surface polished with long horizontal strokes that followed its contour. You checked it for scratches by holding the hand lamp close to the glass and looking across the surface at a shallow angle, the light grazing the curve and revealing every imperfection. There were no scratches, only the faint wear marks that came from years of careful cleaning, a slight softening of the glass's surface that was invisible to the naked eye and did not affect the light's passage. You polished it one final time and then stepped back, looking at the lens as a whole, its prisms gleaming with a clarity that seemed to generate its own light, ready for another night of service. The watchroom was next, its brass and wood and glass all requiring their own forms of attention. You wiped the clock case with a soft, dry cloth, the mahogany warm and smooth under your hand, and you wiped the barometer bezel and the lamp chimney and the pen holder and the handle of the logbook. The desk surface received a thorough wiping, the salt residue lifting away to reveal the dark grain of the oak beneath, and you oiled the drawer slides with a drop of fine machine oil, working the drawers in and out until they moved silently. The spirit stove you cleaned with a cloth dipped in methylated spirits, removing the soot from the burner and the kettle's bottom, and you refilled the spirit reservoir from the bottle in the cupboard, preparing for the next night's tea. The cleaning took you through the afternoon and into the early evening, a slow progression from the top of the tower to the bottom. You wiped the spiral stair railing, the iron handrail that guided your climbs and descents, removing the salt that had made it slightly tacky under your palm. You wiped the door hinges and the latch mechanisms and the window sills and the lamp brackets, every metal surface in the tower receiving its moment of attention. The work was repetitive and calming, a physical meditation that matched the gradual calming of the weather outside, and you moved through it without hurry, knowing that the storm's end was a process to be honored with the same patience as its beginning. The oil stores needed attention, the day tank having burned through most of its contents during the long nights of the storm. You descended to the storeroom and retrieved one of the green tin plate cans, carrying it up the 47 steps with the same careful deliberation you always used. And you refilled the day tank to its brim. watching the amber liquid gurgle into the brass reservoir. The canu returned to its place in the rack, and you made a note in the pocket notebook of the oil consumption over the past 3 days, a figure that would go into the official report when the supply boat returned. The consumption had been higher than normal because of the increased wick setting required by the poor visibility, but not so high as to cause concern. The stores were still ample, the margins still sufficient. The windows of the lantern room had been streaked with salt in their outer faces, the crust too thick to see through clearly, even after the rain had eased. You could not clean the outside while the gallery was still slick with spray, but you could clean the inside thoroughly, and you did so with a cloth and a small amount of vinegar from the storeroom, the mild acid cutting through the salt haze that had accumulated on the inner glass. The difference was immediate. The view through the windows, which had been a blurred impression of grey shapes, resolved into sharp detail, the waves and the clouds and the horizon all coming into focus as if a veil had been lifted. You stood at the cleaned window and looked out at the sea. The wind had dropped another stage in the hour you had been working, its note descending from a howl to a moan, a sound that was almost plaintive after the ferocity of the previous days. The waves were still substantial, their troughs deep and their crests white, but the fury had gone out of them, replaced by a heavy rolling motion that was the aftermath of the storm's energy, a sea that was settling rather than fighting. The rain had stopped entirely, the last drops having fallen while you were polishing the lens, and the clouds above were beginning to show signs of breaking apart. A patch of lighter grey appeared to the north, its edges ragged and shifting, and as you watched it widen slowly, revealing a layer of higher cloud that was thinner and brighter, a pale silver that hinted at the blue beyond. You watched the sky for a long time, standing at the window with your hands resting on the clean brass railing. The break in the clouds grew larger, its edges tearing open like fabric, parting along a seam, and through the gap you saw a colour that you had almost forgotten during the grey days of the storm, a pale washed blue, the colour of a winter sky after rain. It was not a bright blue, not the deep azure of a summer afternoon, but it was blue nonetheless, the first blue you'd seen since the supply boat left, and the sight of it brought a quiet pleasure that was entirely disproportionate to its visual impact. The blue was a promise, a sign that the storm had truly passed and that the world was returning to its normal order. You went down to the watchroom and sat at the desk, opening the logbook to record the observations that marked the storm's end. The entries had been filling the pages for 3 days, neat rows of times and pressures and wind speeds, and now you added the final observations with the same careful hand. Barometric pressure continuing to rise, the needle now approaching the lower edge of normal. Wind backing to the west and dropping to force 5, a fresh breeze rather than a gale, its sound in the ironwork reduced to a soft moan. Sea state moderating, the wave height decreasing, the foam streaks breaking up and dispersing. Visibility improving, now estimated at 5 miles and increasing, the horizon sharp and clear. Cloud cover breaking, with patches of blue sky visible to the north and west, the first sunlight in 3 days beginning to slant through the gaps in pale golden shafts that touched the sea and turned patches of water to a glittering silver. You wrote these observations slowly, savouring the act of recording the storm's passing with the same precision that you had recorded its arrival. The ink flowed from the pen in its familiar rhythm, the letters forming on the page with a neatness that reflected the order being restored to the world outside. When the entry was complete, you blotted it and sanded it and closed the logbook, leaving it on the desk with the pen across the inkwell in the position you always left it. The evening lighting approached, the hour when you would normally climb to the lantern room and prepare the lamp. But tonight the lamp would burn at a lower setting, the visibility having improved enough that the full brilliance was no longer required. You climbed the stairs for the last time that day, the 47 steps and the 12 steps, and you stood in the lantern room with the cleaned lens and the gleaming brass and the lamp flame burning steady and golden inside its crystal heart. Through the windows the sky continued to clear, the blue patches widening and joining together until half the sky was a pale winter blue, streaked with the remnants of the storm clouds, long bands of grey and white that stretched across the horizon like the fading memory of the gale. The sea was still heaving, but the waves were longer now. their crests no longer breaking, and the foam was retreating to the edges of the rocks where it belonged. You adjusted the wick to its standard setting, the flame dropping from its high white brilliance to a softer golden glow, and you stood for a while, watching the beam sweep out across the calming sea. The light would burn through the night as it always burned, but tonight it would burn over a quieter world, a world that was returning to its normal rhythms after 3 days of fury. You had kept the light through every hour of the storm, had trimmed the wick and cleaned the lens and logged the weather and tightened the bolts, and now the storm was passing and the tower was whole and the light was still burning. That was enough. That was life was still burning. You woke on the morning of the 4th day to a quality of light that you had not seen in what felt like a very long time. The grey dimness that had pressed against the tower windows for 3 days had given way overnight to a pale gold glow that slanted through the sleeping alcove's curtain and painted a warm stripe across the iron bedstead. You lay still for a moment, your eyes open to the unfamiliar brightness, and you listened to the silence that had replaced the storm's constant roar. The wind had dropped to a light breeze, a gentle sigh in the ironwork rather than a howl, and the sea had lost its heavy percussive crash against the rocks, settling instead into a long, slow rhythm of swells that rose and fell with a sound like distant breathing. You pushed the blanket aside and sat up, your bare feet finding the cold floorboards. The air in the ground floor room was still and cool, the stove having burned low during the night, but there was a freshness to it that came from the open ventilator, a clean salt smell that was no longer mixed with the sharp bite of driven spray. You dressed in your usual clothes, the wool trousers and the heavy jumper and the boots that had carried you up and down the spiral stairs so many times, and you walked to the ground floor door and unlatched it and stepped outside for the first time since the storm began. The island was transformed. The scrub grass that covered the rocky ground was still wet, each blade bending under the weight of water droplets that caught the morning sunlight and turned into 1,000 tiny prisons, and the rocks themselves were dark with moisture, their surfaces glistening like polished stone. The sky above was a vast dome of pale blue, the color of a robin's egg, with only a few high clouds remaining in the west, long streaks of white that were the last remnants of the departed storm. The sea stretched away to the horizon in a gentle undulating swell, its surface a deep greenish blue that shifted and gleamed as the light moved across it, and the horizon itself was a clean, sharp line, the boundary between sea and sky drawn with a precision that the grey days had made you forget was possible. You stood outside the tower door for several minutes, letting the sun warm your face and the light breeze dry the last of the damp from your jumper. The air tasted clean and fresh, scrubbed of salt and dust by the rain, and it carried the smell of wet earth and seaweed, and the faint sweetness of the island's few wild flowers, small yellow blossoms that had survived the storm by hugging the ground and were now opening their petals to the sun. The gulls had returned, white shapes wheeling above the rocks, their cries a sharp, clean sound that seemed to welcome the calm. You watched them for a while, their effortless gliding on the light air currents, and then you turned and went back inside to begin the morning duties. The lamp had been burning through the final hours of darkness, its beam sweeping out across the calming sea, but now with the sun well above the horizon there was no need for artificial light. You climbed the stairs to the lantern room for the last time that watch, the 47 steps and the 12 steps, and you found the lens still turning, the flame still steady, the clockwork still ticking its quiet measure. You performed the extinguishing ritual with the same care as always, the main oil valve closed, the flame shrinking to a blue flicker, the 30-second wait, the wick lowered into its housing, the final guttering of the flame, the thin trail of smoke rising and dispersing. The pilot flame you left burning as always, its tiny teardrop of light invisible in the morning sun, but still present, a spark of continuity that connected this watch to the next. The lens stopped turning when you engaged the brake lever, the whisper of the mercury float ceasing, and the lantern room became a quiet, glass-walled space filled with sunlight. You stood at the window and looked out at the horizon, the full 20-mile circle of visibility restored, and you could see details that had been hidden for 3 days, the distant smudge of the mainland coast to the east, a low dark line on the edge of the sea, The small islands to the north that were little more than rocks with grass on their tops. The shipping lane to the south, where you could just make out a distant freighter making its way along the coast, its smoke trail a thin dark line against the pale sky. The world had returned, and you were still here to see it. The morning duties occupied the next 2 hours, a sequence of familiar tasks that you performed with the quiet satisfaction of a cycle nearing completion. You wound the clockwork weight back to the top of its travel, the crank turning smoothly under your hands, the chain clinking through its guides. You checked the oil level in the day tank and found it sufficient for another day of burning, though you would refill it in the afternoon to be safe. You cleaned the lens with a chamois cloth, polishing the prisms to a brilliant clarity, and you wiped the windows and the brass and the floor plates, leaving the lantern room in a state of perfect readiness. The logbook recorded every action, the pen moving across the page in its neat rows, the ink drying in the warm air that now carried the smell of the sea rather than the smell of the storm. By mid-morning the sun had climbed high enough to pour its light directly through the lantern room windows, filling the space with a golden radiance that made the brass gleam and the glass prisms scatter rainbows across the white ceiling. You were standing at the window, a mug of fresh tea in your hand, when you saw it, a small dark shape on the horizon to the east, barely visible against the glittering water, but moving with a purposeful, steady rhythm that could only be a boat under power. You watched it for a full minute, tracking its progress as it grew from a speck to a dot to a recognizable shape, and then you set down the mug and walked to the cabinet where you kept the spyglass, a brass telescope with a leather grip that had belonged to the station for as long as anyone could remember. The spyglass was cold and heavy in your hands, its lenses slightly fobbed from disuse, and you wiped it with your sleeve before raising it to your eye. The boat sprang into focus, a stout wooden vessel with a high bow and a cabin painted dull green, a color that matched the sea in certain lights. It was the same boat that had left 3 days ago. The same single-cylinder engine making the same low puttering sound that you could not yet hear but could imagine perfectly. The same man at the tiller with his hand steady on the wooden grip. The supply boat was returning, and with it the world outside the island was reasserting its connection to your small domain. You lowered the spyglass and stood for a moment looking at the distant boat, and then you went to prepare for its arrival. There was no hurry in your preparations because the boat was still miles away and would take the better part of an hour to reach the landing. You descended to the ground floor and gathered the items that needed to go back to the mainland. The canvas mail sack that had been waiting unopened on the work table, now filled with the letters you had written during the storm, brief notes to the Lighthouse service office, and a longer letter to your family that you had composed during the quiet hours of the middle watch. You gathered the empty oil cans from the storeroom, the ones you had drained during the storm's long nights, stacking them beside the door for the boatman to take back for refilling. You gathered the logbooks, the 3 black leather volumes that held a complete record of your time on the station, though you would only hand over the current one for inspection, the others remaining in the tower for reference. And you gathered yourself, taking a moment to stand in the center of the ground floor room and look around at the familiar space, the stove and the work table and the shelves and the broom in its corner, everything in its place, everything as it should be. The boat was closer now, near enough that you could hear the thrum of its engine as a low vibration in the air, the same sound that had faded into the mist 3 days ago and was now returning as if time had paused and was now resuming its normal flow. You walked out of the tower door and down the short rocky path to the landing, the same wet stone quay where you had stood to watch the boat leave, and you waited with your hands in your pockets and the sun warm on your shoulders, watching the boat approach with the patient calm of someone who had nowhere else to be. The boat came alongside the quay with a gentle bump, the engine dropping to an idle, and the boatman threw a line that you caught and made fast to the iron cleat, the rope rough and familiar in your hands. The boatman was the same man who had left 3 days ago, a weathered figure in oilskins and a woolen cap, his face creased by wind and sun into a permanent squint. He nodded to you, a single dip of the chin, and you nodded back, the same wordless greeting you had exchanged on his departure, and then he began to unload the supplies that he had brought, fresh bread and